18th meeting of the Amherst Planning Board. We're fortunate to have a full board here tonight. I want to start out with a special announcement and to congratulate Mr. Schreiber, Mr. Rosnoy, and Mr. Crowner on their reappointment to the Planning Board for additional 3-year terms. So thank you very much for service. Yes. Happy to have you back.
What you meant by welcome back?
The first item on the agenda for tonight is the minutes of June 27th. If anyone has any comments or changes to the minutes, please let me know.
I know.
I'll move to approve.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion of the minutes? If not, all in favor of approving the minutes, please raise your hand. Any opposed? And abstentions? 1. Thank you. Great. Our next item is 7:05 p.m. We have Chris Curtis and Josh Niederbach of the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. They've been kind enough to come here to give us a presentation on transfer of development rights and the draft transfer of development rights bylaw, as well as model solar and wind bylaws. Gentlemen, please come on up and give us your presentation.
Thank you for having us tonight. I'm Chris Curtis with Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. We've been working for the last few months with Jonathan and Christine on a draft of a transfer of development rights bylaw, which we'd like to speak to you a little bit about tonight. By way of quick background, this project originated at the town's request. There was a request under a program called the District Local Technical Assistance Program, which is a state grant that we receive each year and can provide help to a half dozen or more communities on issues that are relevant to smart growth or growth management, sustainable development, issues of that nature. So the town made that request. We are providing the service and assistance free of charge to the community. And we've got, again, a preliminary draft worked out. And we want to talk to you a little bit about that, but I thought it would be helpful to do kind of a quick introduction to transfer of development rights for folks who may be unfamiliar with the concept, or perhaps you've heard about it and just haven't seen how it plays out. So I think it's helpful to kind of have some visual aids for transfer of development rights, because it's a difficult concept to get across in some cases. So if it's okay with you all, I'll start off with that. You know, basically the purpose for transfer of development rights is to protect important natural resources like farmland, like aquifer recharge areas, sometimes other resources that are important to the community are included as well, like upland areas or river corridors. At the same time, one of the key purposes is to promote more compact development in and around existing village centers or town centers oftentimes. In the Pioneer Valley, the sort of case for doing transfer of development rights is laid out in this slide. We have one of the most threatened farmed regions in the United States, according to the American Farmland Trust. We've lost 20% of our farmland over a 15-year period, or about 23,000 acres in the region, which for us, the region is defined as Hampden and Hampshire counties, the Pioneer Valley. And we have a significant amount of residential sprawl, particularly in the form of large lot A&R development that is consuming that farmland. So transfer of development rights is something that allows development rights to be purchased in a sending area and transferred to a receiving area that are designated by the community. The land in the sending area becomes permanently protected, and in the receiving area, the area that receives the development rights is allowed to be developed at an increased density or with certain types of incentives. And the basic process is usually authorized by a special permit. So we've had some experience with TDR, as we call it, in the Pioneer Valley. There are now 5 communities that have adopted TDR ordinances shown here on this map. The one that isn't shown is Palmer, which is the most recent one that has adopted this type of strategy. And there are a number of communities that have cited it as a priority in their master plans or community development plans. So the 4 communities that have some experience with this are Hadley, Hatfield, Westfield, and East Hampton. And they each have slightly different versions of this, but one of the interesting features that Hadley first adopted, and really I think was the first in the country to do this, was they transfer their development rights from a residential zone to a commercial zone, and sort of exchange residential rights for commercial rights, where the development happens is in their commercial and industrial zoning districts. And Hatfield and Westfield and East Hampton have all kind of followed Hadley's lead with some of the provisions of their ordinance. In some cases, communities protect, again, more than just farmland, but also in the case of East Hampton, river corridors and the Holyoke, or rather Mount Tom area is included. So a TDR ordinance fundamentally has, again, sending and receiving areas. These are some examples from Hadley of where they designated their sending and receiving areas. And as you can see, the sending area is essentially the entire town except for the village center and the Route 9 corridor. And that is where the receiving area is located. Their business and industrial zones are the focus for that. So there's an exchange process that goes on from the sending to the receiving area, and each lot that is designated and protected in the sending area is equal to a certain type of incentive in the receiving area. And in many cases, this is just an example, again, using Hadley and their ordinance. There is a slight benefit given to in the receiving area. So one building lot protected in the sending zone is equal to 1.2 residential units in the receiving area. Or it can be used for an increase in the floor area of a commercial or an industrial type of building. And there's also the option in Hadley's case, or in many of these other ordinances, for a cash payment to be made in lieu of the transfer of development rights to kind of streamline and simplify the process to a certain degree. And we'll talk about that a little bit more because it's in the proposed ordinance that we've developed as well. So just to give you kind of a quick example of how this might work and how it plays out, in this example that we're going to show you, a farmer owns 16 acres of land, and under the ordinance you subtract out a certain amount of the wetlands area and the area designated for future roads, and you're left with 11 development rights to transfer. The farmer sells that set of development rights at fair market value to a developer for $270,000 in this example. So this is the parcel, just to kind of give you a visual to go with this, showing what it would look like with a traditional subdivision development that needs to be laid out to show exactly how many lots can be gained from this parcel. And so there's the 11 lots. And this is what it looks like after TDR with the 15 acres of land permanently protected. So I'm going to show you how that translates then to the sending zone. In the sending zone, in this example, the developer owns 17 acres of land, and the current zoning would allow a 60,000 square foot building and require 120,000 square feet of parking. So the developer here, again, buys the 11 development rights from the farmer, and that increases the amount of square footage for buildings by 22,000 square feet and reduces the parking requirements for this particular development. And the additional value of that building area is valued at $347,000. So here's what it looks like sort of before TDR would occur. They can put a 60,000 square foot building on the site with that amount of parking shown. And then we add, with TDR, 22,000 square feet of additional building space, and the parking area does not increase significantly because there was actually a reduction in total parking that was required by the town in this case. So how have we fared in terms of using TDR in the Pioneer Valley? Well, I guess the answer is pretty well in Hadley, not so well in the other communities. We haven't had any TDR transactions in Hatfield, Westfield, or East Hampton yet, but in Hadley there have been at least 10 that we've been able to track so far, and income totaling over $300,000 to the community's conservation fund. And this just kind of gives you a little bit more detail on that in terms of the average per acre price for the agricultural preservation restrictions that have been recorded there. And here is a list of some of the properties that have been protected. Total again of 356 acres. What's interesting about Hadley is they've gained, in this case it looks like it's a little more than $300,000 in revenue to use on purchasing agricultural preservation restrictions. But if you look at the middle column here, the APRs that they've purchased are worth a total of $3.8 million, and that's not even counting the last one, which we don't have a value for yet. So what they've done is they've taken the money from TDR and they've leveraged state money under the Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program, paying roughly 10% of the total cost of protecting these lands from the local share. So really, they've done $3.8 million worth of preservation using TDR money, which is a pretty significant amount of work, I think. So just a couple of conclusions or lessons learned, I guess, as it says here. TDR can be used to preserve more than just farmland, as I said, river corridors, scenic areas, uplands, and as we're proposing in Amherst, also historic areas. The income stream coming from TDR transactions is unpredictable. As I've shown you, some of the communities haven't really been successful in using it, and Hadley has, but each year it's really variable. Protecting small parcels or doing small transactions under TDR is difficult, so having a provision for a cash payment in lieu of the transfer of development rights is really an important feature to an ordinance, and we have included that in the Amherst version of this draft that we have to present to you. And sometimes the costs of doing a conservation restriction and the time frames for doing it are a burden for developers, meaning again that cash payment in lieu of TDR can be very helpful. It's sometimes difficult to connect developers with farmers in a timely basis, so keeping a list of interested sellers is a helpful tool. But oftentimes, it's just difficult for developers to make that contact with the agricultural community. So communities sometimes have to essentially market their TDR ordinances to developers to make sure that the development community is aware of the ordinance and how it might benefit them. So those are some of the basic things that I wanted to cover in terms of TDR and how it works. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the draft ordinance and presenting some of the features that are unique in the Amherst draft to you, and then we can maybe go into question and answer period after that. I will say that the draft ordinance is really a group effort. Jonathan and Christine and I have all contributed components to it, so there's portions of this that have been written by a variety of people, and so we'll probably collectively answer questions about those sections. Do you all have copies of the draft? Great. So I'll try to make this relatively brief so that we can answer your questions, but starting with the purposes section, I would note that the ordinance protects not only farmland but also river corridors, the Holyoke Range, the Pelham Hills area, aquifer areas, and historic properties. As I had mentioned earlier on, doesn't have to be just farmland. And it also serves to support compact, pedestrian-friendly, traditional neighborhood development in several of the village centers and business districts in Amherst. In section 4.3 of the ordinance, there are sending and receiving districts established. The sending area would be identified based on areas that are priorities in the town's open space and recreation plan, and the receiving areas would be specific districts in the village centers and the business and light industrial districts. In section 14.4, there's a special permit process that's established for the transfers, and for farmlands and conservation lands, the process is that initially a conceptual development plan is filed with the special permit granting authority for the land in the sending area, showing how a development would be laid out and how many lots could be created. There's a set of provisions for subtracting out 50% of the wetlands, the floodplains, and the river protection area, and also a specific area for roads that would be required in a development to make this as sort of realistic as possible. The special permit granting authority establishes or determines the number of lots that are eligible for transfer. And then the applicant follows that up by submitting a preliminary development plan for the receiving area, showing how the development rights would be used in the receiving area. They would identify the prospective holder of a conservation restriction or agricultural preservation restriction, or in the case of this ordinance, there's also a historic preservation component. And that holder can be either the town, a nonprofit, or other public or private entities subject to the approval of the town. The applicant also submits the proposed restriction to the town clerk, and there's a review by town council to ensure that those provisions are going to be acceptable. And then the special permit granting authority then makes their decision on the special permit, which can be either to grant the permit, to deny it, or to grant the permit with conditions. And there are specific criteria for making that decision in the ordinance. Once the special permit's approved, the next step in the process is the select board votes to authorize the town's acceptance of the restriction, and then the Conservation Commission accepts the restriction for recording in the County Registry of Deeds. So that section 14.4 is kind of the details of the process for special permit granting. Section 14.5 lays out the dimensional and density requirements of the ordinance, and there are a couple of tables that do this in detail. Table 4 basically conveys the information about what a building lot in the sending area is equal to in the receiving area. So similar to the example that I was showing you in the PowerPoint, in the receiving area, in this proposed ordinance, one building lot can be equal to a 5% increase in building lot coverage in the commercial or industrial zone, or a similar increase in the residential district plus 1.2 residential units for every building lot in the sending area. Or there are a series of other incentives that could be applied, either a reduction in parking, an increase in building height, or a reduction in setback, frontage, or side yard requirements. So there's really a number of choices there. There's a menu of options that are presented to make this more attractive to someone who would be interested in using the ordinance. And then there's a Table 5, which sets out the dimensional requirements for each of the districts that are within the receiving area, and it shows really what those dimensional requirements would be with and then without transfer of development rights, so you can kind of compare the increase or incentive that is allowed in each district. So, for example, in the Village Center residential district, the minimum lot size without TDR is 15,000 square feet. With TDR, it gets reduced to as little as 12,000 square feet, and the frontage goes from 120 feet down to 100 feet. Those are the minimum standards. Section 14.6 in the ordinance is just a discussion of what would happen if there was a need to release a restriction on a property. And it's pretty similar to what you would find for any CR or APR. It requires a series of steps, including a 2/3 vote of the state legislature. So it's not easy to get out from a CR under this ordinance. That's the important point, I guess, from that. And then Section 14.7 is that section that I think is really important to the success of using this ordinance, and that's to provide an alternative to the actual transfer of development rights, which is a cash payment in lieu of transfer. And the reason, again, that's important is it kind of simplifies things for the developer, but it can be equally effective to actually doing the transfer in one step. It really kind of creates a two-step process where you're collecting the revenue stream from purchasing the development rights, and then later on the town or other entities are buying those development rights in the farmland or the resource areas. And as I showed you earlier in Hadley, they've been pretty successful in not only using that revenue stream, but in using it to leverage a much larger revenue stream. So the cash contribution has to be equal in value to the required development rights that are going to be transferred under the special permit. So that's the key issue there. And then Section 14.8 in the ordinance, towards the end here, sets up a registry of willing sellers that the town maintains. Again, this is helpful so that you can make the connection between prospective applicants for TDR and those folks in the sending area that might be interested in selling development rights. And then the final section is 14.9 on banking development rights, and that basically says that anyone can buy development rights in the sending area and hold those for future use, and they don't need a special permit to do that. The special permit is not needed until the transfer for use in the receiving area is proposed. So it encourages the purchase of development rights, and that's I think a positive aspect for the community. So that's my quick synopsis. Jonathan or Christine, do you want to add anything?
Mr. Tucker?
I think I would add that, as was noted, much of this is still in process. You'll note that there are a number of places where there are, staff comments back and forth in italics. We left those in so that you could sort of see the torturous process of our minds as we're trying to work our way through this. There are still some questions to be answered, particularly, we've introduced this relatively unprecedented notion of using transfer of development rights to help preserve historic resources. This is something that was borne in upon us during the village center process, the degree to which Amherst residents value historic properties. It adds some complications to how you would do this, how you would, for instance, determine the value of the rights being transferred from an historic property to somewhere else. We did allow for, in the case of historic properties, that receiving areas can be sending areas as well. Historic properties are everywhere, and particularly in village centers, for instance, you can have a historic property on another, or a historic structure on one property and want to transfer development rights to another property in the same zoning district, or perhaps even on the same property. So we're trying to build in flexibility and still have this make sense. We will need to run some of this by town council, as we will with all of the other zoning that goes forward. But we think this is very promising, and it's been a privilege to work with Chris to try and make this something that Amherst does in its usual unique way.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Ms. Brestrup, did you have anything to add?
I just would add that, as Jonathan said, some of this is still being worked on, and one of the things that's being worked on is the exact dimensional benefit that developers would get, because our Table 3, as you know, already allows modification of certain dimensional requirements by special permit, by the special permit granting authority. So we have to see how that works in with this transfer of development rights.
Thank you very much. Flipping through the proposed article, it's very much a draft at this point. There are a number of questions highlighted in there. I would urge everyone to read those questions and consider any additional issues that they can think of to bring up now that we've had an introduction to this idea. So thank you very much for coming in, giving us that talk. We have a second piece coming from the PVPC, which is the model solar and wind bylaws. Would you like to swap seats?
Yes. This is Josiah Niederbach from our staff.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening, everyone. As Chris said, my name is Josiah Niederbach from PVPC. I just wanted to quickly run through, you have some documents that we provided you ahead of time in your packets regarding both wind and solar bylaws. And I just wanted to run quickly through those with you tonight, and then also get your input on moving forward what kind of wind or solar bylaws the planning board and the town would be interested in developing, specifically the size requirements for what facilities would be permitted, and so on. So the first two bylaws that I'd like to go over are model bylaws provided by the state. These are guidelines for conforming to the Green Communities Act. They're called model as of right zoning bylaw for solar and wind. To conform with the Green Communities Act, these facilities are fairly large. Solar facilities need to generate at least 250 kilowatts of electricity, which is approximately 1 acre of a site to develop that. And the wind facility is required to develop generate 600 kilowatts of power, which is approximately at least a 250 foot facility, wind turbine. So those are fairly large facilities. On the other side of that, there's also in your packets information on bylaws that local communities in the Pioneer Valley have adopted. One being in Northampton, which adopted a bylaw permitting research and development facilities, which is another way of conforming to the Green Communities Act of renewable resources, so wind and solar. You can see that that's pretty modest language and pretty short, only a couple paragraphs. And finally, for Chesterfield adopted a wind bylaw that is for smaller facilities, less than 60 kilowatts of wind power. And those are, under 100 feet, 35 to 100 feet in height of the turbine. And so those are four different bylaws that I've provided you with tonight. My question, I think, that I'd like to get input from the board is if there's any input on what size facility you'd be interested in pursuing. Is there any input that anybody has on that moving forward?
Mr. Tucker.
Amherst is already pursuing a solar array or facility on our abandoned old landfill, or covered old landfill. And we have two ways in our current bylaw of addressing solar and wind facilities of the two scales, in industrial or commercial versus residential. We have a category in the bylaw that is entitled transformer station or other energy facility use. In most districts, that's by special permit. In a couple of districts, in the commercial district, light industrial district, that is by site plan review by right. That is sufficient for us to meet the green communities threshold, we believe. We're still waiting for our notification, but we believe that gets us over that threshold. In terms of any facility, solar or wind, that would be installed as a residential use, that would be simply considered an accessory structure under the bylaw and not reviewed substantially more than that, except under the building code. The issue is whether or not the board would want to have more specific control over these two general categories of alternative energy facilities. We have mailboxes into which they fit now, approximately. The special permit process, particularly for the larger facilities, allows us to come at almost any aspect of a facility that would be proposed. But the bylaw is not designed to address the specific characteristics of those. Neither does the bylaw under accessory uses or accessory structures for someone who wants to put up, for instance, a wind tower in their backyard. We do not have ways to specifically address the unique aspects of wind power facilities as opposed to a radio tower or something else that the bylaw would address simply in terms of setbacks and so forth. So part of what you would think about as we're contemplating these, the model bylaws that have been presented and the ways in which other communities are regulating this, is the degree to which Amherst needs to regulate this in a specific fashion or not. And one of the ways to do that, I think, is to read these through and deal with, think about the various aspects that are unique to these uses and facilities as opposed to the catch-all categories we currently have.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Ms. Brestrup.
Also, one thing that's worthy of consideration, I think this is right, that the state law prevents communities from denying an application for a solar array. You can use a special permit, which we are using on the landfill, but you cannot deny the special permit. You need to figure out a way to condition it and allow it. I don't think that's true of the wind facilities. I think the wind facilities are not exempt from town zoning bylaws. And so with wind facilities right now, I remember when there was a proposal to put up a tower in someone's yard for communication. And the building commissioner was sort of at a loss as to how to regulate that, and she ended up regulating it based on height limitations of wireless telecommunication devices. So you might want to think about, particularly the height limitation with regard to wind power facilities and whether you would like to have the ability to regulate that. And to add to this, we believe that we comply with the criteria that are needed for the green communities designation. We have received a letter from our town council saying that our bylaw currently complies with criteria 1 and 2, which have to do with citing alternative energy research and development facilities, where we can do that in certain areas of town, in addition to Jonathan's comment on the transformer stations covering us for some of the actual installation of these facilities. So we think we're covered as far as green communities goes, but the question is whether you would like the ability to regulate a wind turbine. Do you want something 450 feet, or how do you want to deal with that? And that, they're coming, because I went out to the Berkshires last weekend and saw a few of them. And so Amherst may want the opportunity to be able to say where those are going to go and how tall they can be, et cetera. So those are just some thoughts.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kruger?
Mr. Chair, do we have now an opportunity to talk about the transfer of development rights, which I think we have all the drafters here. I have more comments. I'm in favor of solar and wind. It doesn't sound like we currently have a major regulatory problem, and given the ambitiousness of our zoning agenda already, I'm willing to kind of let that lay dormant for a little while, which is not any comment against wind or solar. But in looking at the transfer of development right issue, I don't want it to be a foregone conclusion that we just want to jump into that as our next zoning topic. I know we asked for technical assistance, but I have a number of questions. I know Hadley's used it, but across the state of Massachusetts, it hasn't been a very effective tool. I think of it as a benign tool. I don't think it would hurt us, but I don't know that it would really advance our goals hugely. And the real stumbling block I see is the receiving areas. And when I think about Amherst zoning over the last 30 years, I feel like we've done transfer of development right writ large. We've looked at areas that we need to protect, we've bought land, and we've done a lot of protective zoning and land use regulation and purchase, and we've tried to move towards higher density in village centers, in certain locations in downtown, and we've hit, we've probably been about 30% successful in the receiving area concept. But it's very hard to find areas where the credits can be used. And I think Hadley is somewhat of a unique and different situation. So the little bit I've talked to other planners, it's just not something that's easy to do. The other kind of underlying question I have is, if the parking is, 100 spaces, but it can be 80 spaces with this, then why don't we just have it be 80 spaces? Because it means there's nothing wrong with the 80 spaces. And then when I looked at the chart, it looked like in a village, for example, in a village center, there'd be one development pattern for things that were built using the credits, because it's a different standard of dimensions, and then another development pattern where things were built not using the credits. So we end up with two development standards in a village center. So I have some kind of underlying global questions about how much we want to pursue this right now.
Just before I call on you, Mr. Schreiber, I just want to say that we've got about 15 minutes or so for discussion on this. This was intended to be a presentation to us and an introduction to these topics. So this isn't going to be an extensive, long discussion tonight on this. Mr. Schreiber?
I'll only take 15 minutes.
Okay.
So really, my initial comments are very similar to what Connie was mentioning at the end, that if you look at all the dimensional requirements for, as we have them now, and then with transfer of development rights, if we think that our community would still be okay with the transfer of development rights, minimum lot sizes, minimum frontages, then we should just go through the process of changing all of those dimensions. And actually, I think that there's a lot of, good things in there. Smaller lot sizes, taller buildings. I mean, I think that there's actually quite a bit of promise in, that by itself. So that's one. And the other one is that, there are some things like changing the front setback, because we've had this discussion about how many things in the zoning bylaw are for aesthetic reasons. So, for example, front setback is to have harmony on the street edge. And so I guess, and I know that this is just a first draft, but
It is.
Yeah, just kind of pick and choose those. But so conceptually, I have this exact same issue with that if we think that the dimensions are okay after transfer of development rights, then we should just pursue those for everyone.
Before I get back to you, Mr. Tucker, let's see if there's any quick questions from the public here about either of these topics. Okay, Mr. Tucker?
I want to respond briefly to the point that both Ms. Kruger and Mr. Schreiber have made about if the end product in terms of density here it makes sense, why don't we just do that? For the reason that Ms. Kruger cited earlier, that our attempts to do that in the past have met with about 30% success, and that every additional reason to encourage that, including the transfer of development rights and perhaps other reasons that we can bring to bear, increases the likelihood that that percentage will go up. We have had, like it or not, and some of us don't, some of us do, those two things are operating in tandem. The town has for 50 years been in the process of preserving open land of various critical kinds and has done that very successfully. It's almost as successfully or more successfully than any other community in the Commonwealth. People don't really see it out there because it's not labeled on as you drive down the street. This is preserved land, although we're trying to get the signs up. So it's much easier to preserve something out there than it is to allow something to come next door. And to the extent that we can say, if you will allow this next door, then that piece of land out there that you cherish, for whatever reason, will be preserved in the process. Then I think we enhance all of it. Is that a fair balance over a 50-year period? Probably not. Is it possibly a necessary balance? Probably.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Ms. Ford?
I just needed a little bit of clarification about the cash stream that is talked about in this, because it seems to be almost an equal. There's the preservation piece. There's the ability to make something denser and different in a zone, and then there's this bit about putting some money in the bank or in the town coffers. So I need to understand that a little bit better. I'm not quite sure where that is in the balance of the motivation to make this change.
Mr. Curtis, would you like to comment?
I guess I would say that the revenue stream, first of all, wouldn't go into the general fund. It goes into a specific conservation fund to be used only for the purposes of preservation of land or resources or historic features. So it's very targeted, can't be used for anything else. And again, it's something that I think the streamlining feature of it is really important, because it eliminates the need for a prospective developer to make contact with, find a willing seller, and negotiate a purchase of the development rights all before they submit their project. which could be a very time-consumptive process to do. It enables a development to move forward more efficiently and still give the town the benefit of the preservation value as well.
I don't understand how the leveraging works. It seems to me that there's a stream of income coming in Hadley, but I don't understand how that's being transferred. I mean, what's happening to that money?
Sure. In Hadley, they do have a conservation fund established, so the revenue stream goes into that and is held until there is a application for an agricultural preservation restriction by a farmer. Let's say it's a farm that's valued, to pick a number, at $1 million. The state, under its APR program, has required communities to provide a 10% match. Sometimes it's a little more. In Hadley's case, many of their acquisitions have been done under that provision, where they pay $100,000 out of that $1 million protection total. The state pays $900,000. So you're basically leveraging that $900,000 in state resources against your conservation fund. And Hadley's done, again, that very successfully with 10 parcels now.
So has Hadley actually had any actual transfers, or have they all been cash payments?
They've all been cash in lieu payments. They haven't done any transfers. But I will say, both halves of the transaction have taken place in each case. In the case of the 10 payments, there were 10 farms preserved. There were also 10 developments that were built at a higher density or reduced parking requirement or some combination of those incentives. So both halves happened. They just didn't have to happen simultaneously at the same time.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay.
Does that satisfy your questions for?
Getting there.
Please ask it further. If you
Okay,
need to.
so I know, I'm sorry I'm sounding so dense about this. So, because this town is famous for all the APRs and the amount that we've done over the years. So I'm trying to imagine the scenario here, that we do a transfer. And, or say it's just a cash payment. Let's just pretend we're doing it like Hadley, and there's a cash payment. The particular parcel that the cash payment is being made against gets a restriction right out of the gate. And that money goes into this preservation fund, which could potentially be the 10% on yet an additional parcel somewhere else. Is that how it works?
I think actually, to be more clear about it, when the payment is being made by the developer who owns a parcel of land in the receiving zone. So the developer is making that payment to the town and then going forward with the special permit application to do a higher density development in the receiving zone.
Okay.
The money goes into a fund. It doesn't necessarily get used right away for preserving a piece of land in the sending zone. That could happen at a later date. It could happen again, like I was mentioning in Hadley, when a farmer applies for an APR or a project comes up that the town's working on, that they need resources to buy a conservation restriction, or in this case, a historic preservation restriction. So that second piece can happen at a later date.
Okay.
That help?
Now I got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Yes, Mr. O'Keefe.
Thank you. So just to follow up on that scenario, the second half of that transaction that you just described, it sounds to me like that would not necessarily be governed by the ordinance that we're talking about here. That would just be, or could just be, a traditional purchase of an APR or conservation restriction, as Amherst and plenty of other towns are doing today. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. The special permit process governs the development in the receiving area. So like the land banking provision in the ordinance indicates that the protection of the land can be done separately from that special permit process.
Thank you very much, Mr. Curtis. Oh, yes, Mr. Carson.
Do you have examples of, am I too close or?
Sorry, they'll adjust it.
Okay. Do you have examples of towns that have done this, that the receiving end has been a downtown area? Because that's most likely what would happen here. Hadley is a unique situation because of the Route 9 business corridor, but we don't have that here. Do you have an example in the state or another state?
I don't have an example from the region because I don't think one exists, but there are examples certainly across the country of that type of use occurring. And if you're interested, I can try to get you some more details about that for
I think that
a
would be
future
helpful.
meeting.
Yeah.
Anything else? Yes.
So I have two sort of long-range questions or proposals if we decide to go forward with this. One is there a way in here to preferentially make the receiving area downtown as opposed to a village center? So you get 1 credit for a village center, but that credit is worth 2 points or whatever in a downtown. And the second one is this designed or can it be adapted so that at some future point development rights can be transferred across town boundaries?
Yeah. Good questions. The answer to the first one is yes. You could certainly establish that set of standards so that there were incentives for specific districts that were a little bit more incentivized, if you will. Really, the town can decide to do whatever you choose with that table of dimensional standards and districts. So that's very flexible. The idea of transferring across town boundaries has been suggested a number of times, and I think it's a really interesting idea, but the difficulty is that we're so parochial in Massachusetts that there's always going to be a perception of a winner and a loser, I think, in a transfer like that. One community gets a piece of, say, farmland preserved, the other community gets a higher density development. Well, that might be perceived as a win-win in some cases, but maybe not in every case. So that's kind of been a tough stumbling block for us. It does work that way in many other states where they have county government and county zoning in some cases.
Never mind getting a special permit past 2 zoning board of appeals.
Exactly.
Further questions from the board? Anyone? Comments? All right. Thank you very much, both of you, for coming in tonight. I'm going to take just a minute among the board here and discuss whether, at what point we want to bring these up again for further discussion, having reviewed them. First, with respect to the transfer of development rights, do we want to revisit this in, say, one of our August meetings to discuss whether we want to move forward with it? Or okay, I'm sensing a yes. We have meetings on August 8th and 22nd. Is that correct?
1st and 15th.
1st and 15th. How are we for booking on those days?
You have 2 items on the 1st so far. I'll explain them. You asked to have the zoning enforcement officer come in and speak with you, and he is also bringing the building commissioner and the health director with him. So I think that's going to be a fairly robust discussion. And then the gentleman who owns property at the intersection of Southeast Street and Belchertown Road has asked to come in and speak with you about a potential development for his property. He may come in on the 1st, he may come in on the 15th. And then you have a continuing discussion about housing and zoning that you need to deal with. So those are the things that are on your plate for the 1st. For the 15th, you may have more flexibility.
It sounds to me like the 15th would be a better date for us to come back to this. So let's put it on the agenda for that day. Mr. Tucker?
If I may, that would also give us time to respond to some of the questions and explore some of the possibilities that have been raised.
Thank you. As to the solar and wind bylaws, is there a sense on the board of whether we want to try to pursue these at this point? Do we want to revisit them, try and take a little more control over these energy facilities? Mr. Crowner?
I think it's useful, and I would like to have some sort of guidelines on our books, but I don't see it as a priority, given the other things that are already on our list. So, I mean, I don't want to dismiss it. I'd like to add it to the list, but, you know, a little ways down the list.
Well, are we talking, say, after fall town meeting?
Or after a Springtown meeting.
We have a proposal to put this off for 1 year. Mr. Carson?
I would suggest revisiting it after the fall town meeting and then deciding whether we could talk about it before the spring or whether to delay it.
Okay. Ms. Brestrup, can we make a note to revisit this in December, please?
Yes, sir.
I said please. Thank you. And thanks for coming in.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Sure, please come forward to the microphone.
Would it be possible to get that very excellent slideshow on the TDR put up on the town website, please?
I will find out. Would that be possible?
Chris, is that available on the PVPC website? Okay.
All right, we'll make it available on one website or the other.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It is available through Amherst Media, because if you go on Amherst Media for this particular meeting, you can find it there.
You can catch the whole presentation, that's true.
Including what was shown on the screens.
It'll be up there.
Sure. If I may, I'd still like to ask
Yeah.
that it go up.
Sure.
Thanks. Some things are easier to get to than others.
Thank you very much for your comment. Okay, the next item on our agenda is the CDBG, Community Development Block Grant Advisory Committee. We are going to have a discussion about public process for the 2013 Community Development Strategy. And who is going to lead this discussion?
I'm co-chair of the CDBG. Good evening. Hi, I'm Yana McClure. I'm the co-chair of the CDBG Community Block Grant Advisory Committee, I believe we're now renamed. So, and I think Mary Jane, if you wanted to come up as well.
Yes, ma'am. I was hiding.
Would you just like me to start, or did you
yes, please.
launch right into it?
Yep.
So it's a quick little presentation or just request that we are beginning our CDBG committee process, and we are a mini entitlement. Amherst is one of 10 towns in Massachusetts that has received since 2006 mini entitlement, and we're starting our 2013 application process for $900,000. So 60 of which would go to non-social service agencies, I guess, or providers, and then 20% would go to social services, and then 20% for admin. So with that,
Not much money.
no. So with that process, what we have is a community development strategy that has to be submitted with the application process. And we came to you last year, and we had Mr. Crowner join us in last year's process, which we're requesting again. He did join us last week or couple of weeks ago, as we head up this process again. So the community development strategy that we might have to submit is basically based off the master plan, which of course you're well involved in. So when we hold the public hearing for, which will be August 9th, and I don't think we have a time yet, but we'll, if you're willing to be our liaison again, you'll know about that time and date. But what we're doing is going to present before the public to request their input on our community development strategy and a sense of priorities that they'd like to have the town take note of, and just request their time or, you know, their input for that strategy. And that's what we're asking, if the planning board could, again, be involved in this particular year. Last year, I believe the board held the meeting. This year, we're going to hold it ourselves. I think it was a bit confusing for the public to sit before the planning board and ask you questions where in actuality, it was the CDBG that sort of really needed it. So I think it was confusing for everyone. So we're going to change that format, ask that Mr. Crowner come and be the liaison for that evening for when those questions come up that, you know, you have more expertise in answering.
Thank you, Ms. McClure. Mr. Crowner?
Yeah, so I'm interested, and definitely interested in participating. Unfortunately, I'll be out of town that time, so can't. But I would like to comment about the development strategy. So the planning board is tasked with adopting a master plan and in some way implementing it. This is a key way of implementing the master plan. It's leveraging money from the state to achieve some of the goals that are actually spelled out in the master plan. And so when they're developing their strategy that they're submitting as part of their application process, it's reflecting those goals, it's stating those goals, it's explaining how it's going to actually fulfill some of the things that are in our master plan. So it's important for the board to be aware of what they're doing, and ideally to be participating in it. So that's why I think it's important. And since I won't be able to be there, I hope that somebody else who is familiar with the master plan or familiar with the town planning process can attend in my stead.
Thank you, Mr. Crowner.
I second that too. We really hope that someone could actually attend, but we can have that conversation at a different time.
August 9th is a Thursday.
Is it a Thursday? It may be. Yep, it is August 9th. But we can possibly, I mean, I think these dates just got posted recently. We could probably highlight it with the change of date. It's still well enough in advance time that if we can shift the date, because you've been with our meetings, you probably have a little bit more in-depth background, so, you know, perhaps we can talk about dates that better match your schedule.
In lieu of that, is there someone who's willing to step up and be a backup for that? I will do it if Mr. Crowner can't.
Excellent, thank you.
All right. Was there anything else anyone wanted to add? We certainly thank you for your hard work.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, Ms. Brestrup.
I just wanted to say that I spoke with Nate Malloy today, who is the staff person for the advisory group. And he suggested that if planning board members have comments on the strategy from last year, that the strategy for this next year will be similar to that. And so you may want to send your comments to staff, and then we can forward them to the committee. Since you won't be able to, since all of you won't be able to attend the strategy public hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Brestrup.
Can I just ask, did everyone receive? I know it's in draft form, but the 2013, okay.
We received the 2012, actually.
It should be the same language, it's that the date is changed. I will double-check that with Nate, but I believe because we haven't changed it all, that's why it's now a draft, because now it's 2013, but it should be exactly the same.
Yes, Ms. Kruger.
We made comments and wrote on this and gave it to staff. It would be as if we were writing on the draft 2013.
Exactly.
Perfect.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And I urge everyone to try to attend that meeting on August 9th.
We might be there.
Backstage. No, not.
Okay. Moving on to old business. We have a review of some items on a site plan review. This is SPR 2012 00006 M13239 249 South Pleasant Street. This is Amherst College. We had a couple of conditions. We had requested that the applicant provide us with a sample lease with specific provisions and the town engineer's comments on the project. And I believe that the applicant has provided those things. They've added an excellent provision to their lease, which states that tenant shall not permit the leased premises to be overloaded, damaged, stripped, or defaced, nor suffer any waste, and shall not keep or use sofas or other indoor upholstery furniture on any porches, entryways, lawns, driveways, sidewalks, or any other paved or unpaved outdoor areas. That appears to meet our criteria.
Sofa bylaw.
We're slowly developing a preferred condition here. And the engineer statement, am I,
It's on the last page. It's on the last page of this.
okay.
Send it in an email.
So that provision has been met as well. Could we have a motion on those conditions, please? If everyone's satisfied. Or we can wait for Ms. Kruger to return if we need to. Yeah, I think we better wait. We're reviewing the site plan review conditions 4 and 6 with respect to the lease and the town engineer's comments. Do you have any comments or questions? Okay.
Has
What was that?
Mr. Crowner.
I move to confirm that conditions 4 and 6 of the site plan review for 249 South Pleasant Street have been met.
Second.
Further discussion? All in favor? Passes unanimously. Thank you. And thanks to Amherst College for getting back to us so quickly with those. We have a signing of decision next. This is SPR 2012-00007, M13281, 79 South Pleasant Street. Trustees of Amherst College. This is the old Baptist Church. Any corrections or modifications to the record of decision? It's seems complete to me.
May I pass it around for your signature?
There's no objections? Okay. Yes.
And I apologize, I do not have the accompanying page that Mr. Weber needs to sign, so I'm going to have to get back to you in a day or two about that.
Okay.
And I also have the minutes, if you wouldn't mind signing those at this time, too.
Of course.
Just Mr. Weber? Thank you.
All right, we have next the zoning subsection of our meeting, beginning with a report from the zoning subcommittee. Mr. Crowner.
Okay, so zoning subcommittee met earlier this evening, and we were pleased to be joined by Stephen and Connie and Richard. We hope that one or more of them will be willing to be appointed to the committee. What happened in the meeting was we saw a presentation by a resident of Fearing Street, describing the turnover of his neighborhood, or the change in his neighborhood of residences to what he called unsupervised, non-owner occupied rental units. So a lot of what the zoning subcommittee and the planning board has done over the last some years has been responding to concerns about housing, and these concerns are expressed anecdotally and emotionally, as they should. What this presentation offered was some data and some pictures, graphs, maps that made the situation, I think, a little more concrete, or at least presented in a different way than we've seen in the past. So I would encourage members who have not seen the presentation yet to watch it. It was Amherst Media was here and they recorded it, including the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to watch it. It starts 15 minutes into the program. It lasts for 25 minutes or so, and there's discussion afterwards. That was also very interesting. So it's a lot of the recommendations that might have come out of this presentation, or that did come out of this presentation, I think were addressed, at least in some way, by the proposed residential use amendments that the staff has drawn up. And so the second part of our meeting was an overview of these proposed amendments. I guess I would defer to Mr. Tucker for an explanation if we need it, but I'll quickly summarize. And that is, it's being proposed that one family and two family residential uses be divided into two classes of residents. One that is owner occupied, one that is non-owner occupied, so that these can be regulated differently. It sets up a situation where a non-owner occupied use of such a property would have oversight by the zoning board of appeals, which it does not now in the case of single family homes, and which it does not in the case of duplexes in some neighborhoods. Another of the amendments would clarify what a converted dwelling is, as opposed to a duplex. There's considerable confusion right now in many people's minds, mine included, about a property that is proposed to be changed from a single-family home to a duplex. Is that a duplex or is that a conversion? And so this clarifies it, that it would make it a conversion. And in most cases, a conversion, or I think in all cases, a conversion would be by special permit. It also allows for a conversion it provides an opportunity for a conversion to take place in areas that otherwise would not allow a duplex, which I think is an interesting addition to the document. There's also considerable confusion among the public and possibly among the board about what a lodging or boarding house is. That also is proposed to be clarified and strengthened, so that when we're regulating these things, we know what we're talking about, and we're handling it in a systematic way. In all cases, in all of these residential use amendments, it's being proposed that a condition be added that when a residential use is being used for rental, that it must be registered with the town's rental registration / permitting procedure, which exists but is not really being used, and which there seems to be a general consensus among members of the board and the public that it needs to be more strongly enforced, and that the conditions that it should be enforced in a way that unsupervised rental units are monitored and penalized in a way that problems don't develop and spread. So there's several other residential use amendments. I think that's the general summary. There's also, we also looked at the other amendments that have been proposed, including agricultural processing use, watershed protection, transfer development rights. We looked at Atkins Corner again as a in the context of how roadways are we have a map that shows a mixed use on both sides of the street as a way of understanding how a village center or downtown works or doesn't work if it doesn't have a double-sided mixed use permitting. And so these are I guess context for the possible consideration of moving forward with Atkins. What we need to do, what the board needs to do, and that's, I guess, coming up next, is figuring out how we're going to handle zoning amendments and which ones we should go forward with and how we're going to do that. There's only a few meetings left of the zoning subcommittee and the planning board before we have to start making decisions about which ones we're going to pick. Because if we're going to do more than a couple of them, we need to start having public hearings soon, possibly as early as the first meeting in September. So this is, we need to start focusing our discussion on end results quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Croner. So we have a number of proposed amendments that Mr. Croner just detailed for us. And it sounds like we sort of need to do a prioritization of them in terms of the order we're going to address them in. That about right? Well, at the last meeting, the planning board talked about handling zoning amendments in a different way, possibly. So I think both need to happen. We need to figure out how we're going to do this, and then which ones we're going to do. And are we clear on who is going to be serving on the zoning subcommittee at this point? Ms. Kruger?
Don't we have it on our agenda that we're going to we're going to talk about whether we're going to have a zoning subcommittee, so I don't know if they dovetail, but,
Yeah,
okay.
please weigh in,
Oh,
but you gotta use the mic.
I've been thinking a lot about this sort of conundrum that we have with the zoning subcommittee and the full planning board, and it was really helpful to get the full packet for the zoning subcommittee ahead of time, and I realized how much I had probably been missing for a while. And it seemed, and I was really motivated to come to your meeting. I was glad I did. And it seems like sometimes that's where the real action happens, and I don't know how to balance wanting the full board to be more involved. I totally agree that the presentation from Rolf, Rolf Karlstrom would have been a real benefit, I think, to the full board. Trying to balance wanting the full board to be looking at Atkins together versus the time issue. I mean, I've been sitting here since 5 o'clock without food, which is okay, but how to realistically manage the desire to move forward on a number of important zoning amendments and wanting the full board to have a fundamental role. So I don't have a real answer, and I'm somewhat tipping towards joining the zoning subcommittee is the only way to survive the conundrum. You know, it's sort of like.
Second.
And second, because you want to do it. But I just want to hear what people are thinking, because I know we don't all have time to do this, and it seems overwhelming, but it doesn't feel right to have all these public hearings happening sort of off stage, and then a distillation that comes to the full board.
Thank you, Ms. Carter. Ms. Anderson.
Connie, my thought is that, you know, a lot of us serve on other subcommittees and whatever, and I think it's great that you want to be on the zoning subcommittee. I would make a motion with that as well. But our meetings are already pretty chock-a-block full here. I mean, when we start at 7, you know, we've been here easily till 9:30, 10 o'clock. And then there's not so much a food issue, but it's just a matter of being able to concentrate or having more frequent meetings. And I like having the synthesis come in from the people who have dealt with it every day, because I find zoning myself to be overwhelming. And if any of us have a hot topic, the meetings are always open and welcome to attend. So I guess my feeling would be that that does continue to have a subcommittee and they're the experts in that area. I mean, all of us get to drill down on our particular topics of our whatever subcommittees we're on and other boards, and we have this overlap, which is great. So I guess I would ask the board to consider to keep it a separate subcommittee for us to attend occasionally as we can. You know, meeting from 5 to 10 isn't a real draw, you know. Granola bars and bottles of water might help, but anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Yes, Mr. Carson.
Steve, would you want to explain about your suggestion about the structural changes? Because I thought that was a good idea.
So I pretty much volunteered to serve on the zoning subcommittee. And I think that requires board approval. But so one of the issues is that I've relied, really on my 3 years here, I really relied on the zoning subcommittee to fill us in. So I've only been to a couple of previous meetings. But one of the ideas I had was for this idea of bringing the whole planning board into the discussion is to move the public comment part of the zoning subcommittee meetings to the full planning board. And so that the zoning subcommittee meetings itself would be really a working session of those who've volunteered to be on that particular subcommittee, with, of course, open to the public. But then the public comment part would happen before the full planning board. And perhaps the zoning subcommittee report would be the first agenda item.
But still continue to have a zoning subcommittee.
Yes.
Ms. Ford.
I like that idea, and I was before you even mentioned that, I was going to suggest that I also like the way this, this topic tonight is where it is in the agenda, and wondering how some aspect of the meeting that you do prior could always come, and I don't know if you can do this prior to a meeting night, know what portion of a meeting could come before the full board, but if it could be the public comment, that certainly makes a lot of sense to me.
To say it makes sense to me too. Yes, Mr. Rosnoy.
I still stand by my comments from our last meeting that I think zoning subcommittee ought to be reorganized. Whether it's called zoning subcommittee might be another thing, but the way Mr. Schreiber just described it, it might be a workable method of doing so. What I see staff has come up with, what Mr. Tucker has come up with, is a whole bunch of potential town meeting articles dealing with housing issues in various formats. So, for example, according to my comments from the last meeting, a task force or a zoning subcommittee or whatever you want, a subcommittee of the planning board might be formed to work on all of the housing issues, for example. And there might be a different group of members from the planning board who might want to work on things like transfer of development rights or solar and wind power, and yet a different group that might want to work on South Amherst, Atkins Corner rezoning. So I still see that as a viable way of proceeding. Maybe that's in effect what might happen if Mr. Schreiber's model takes effect. But I still worry about a core group of 3 people having such a first of all, an onerous job of going through all of those things, and secondly, being the focus of all of the zoning changes that happen in the town. I was pleased to see such a large attendance from citizens here tonight. However, we notice that most of them have left, and it's this planning board that actually makes the decisions about all of those zoning issues. So perhaps Mr. Schreiber's method will coordinate those things in some way. But I still remain opposed to the zoning subcommittee having such a massive laundry list of things to work on. And you'll notice, for example, that the list of possible zoning amendments that Mr. Tucker presented really is not connected to the prior work order list that the zoning subcommittee spent so much time on: priority A, priority B, priority C, those kinds of things. But it's, in effect, what's really needed right now, and that's to be commended because it is really needed right now. So as more of these practical zoning amendments come forward, particular subcommittee of the planning board dealing with them, I think might be the best way to approach it.
Thank you, Mr. Rosnoy. Mr. O'Keefe?
Thank you. I think the zoning stuff comes down to 2 main questions that we need to deal with. One of them is what we're going to work on, and one of them is how the zoning is going to be structured. And that, to me, divides the workload between the board and the subcommittee. I think that the board can and should be very involved in the what question and determining priorities. But I definitely see a lot of value, having done it myself, obviously, for years, in having a small group that's more hands-on, dealing with the how, the writing, the language, and going through line by line and dealing with all the minutia of what the zoning is going to be. I don't see that being productive, certainly at the board level, and I also see that potentially an issue if you have sort of a revolving cast of characters who's dealing with different subject matter or focused working groups or task forces or whatever we might want to call them. So I do see value in having a dedicated subcommittee that knows the stuff in depth and spends a lot of time working on it. But I would also like to see the board continue to or enhance what we've been doing over the last few meetings, which is having just meaningful discussions at our board meetings about what we think we should be working on and what our priorities are. Because I agree with Richard that having a subset of our board determining those priorities is not the best way forward. I think that should be a board decision and not a decision of any subset of the board. And I think that the structure that we have, this is probably the first time we've done it this way in terms of our agenda, but having a zoning item on the agenda fairly early in the evening, here we've got it under old business, gives us room to have what we had tonight, a meaningful and detailed report from the subcommittee about the issues that they've been talking about, and then hopefully to be followed up with a discussion amongst ourselves about our feelings on those issues and what we want the priorities to be. But I think having that be a standing item on the agenda much earlier in the meeting than the typical way we've done it in the past, where it's something that happens at 10:25 when everybody wants to get out of here and nobody really has any appetite to have a substantive discussion amongst the board. I think that alone is a big step that will lead to a more productive discussion amongst ourselves about it.
I'm in agreement with just about everything that's been said here. I think, as far as going where we go forward, it seems to me that if we have a viable zoning subcommittee, given the time constraints, it doesn't make sense to try to completely eliminate that at this point. Given that at least 2 members are longtime members of the zoning subcommittee, and we potentially have 2 more who are semi-committed.
Committed. Make a motion. I'll make a motion. Should we make a motion?
Please go ahead.
Well, I move that Mr. Schreiber and Ms. Kruger be appointed to the zoning subcommittee.
Second.
Okay, all in favor, and you can vote. I think do we have to do them separately?
Well, I was wondering about maybe some discussion. Could we hear from the individuals about whether they want to be?
Thelma and Louise.
Which one are you?
Oh, come on, Bonnie and Clyde.
But they all went off a cliff.
I'm willing and eager to serve.
Willing and reluctantly agreeing to serve.
Sounds like 2 yeses to me. We do have a motion that's been seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor? You can vote for yourself.
If we don't, that would be bad.
That passes unanimously.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That being settled for the moment, should we take some time now and try and prioritize these amendments while we're on the subject? I think we should. We don't have a list, per se, of these.
There is a list, but it went to
I think there's a list here.
you were all,
Yeah, I looked right past it.
No, it wasn't in our packet. It was in the zoning subcommittee.
it's not in your packet. It was sent to you along with the zoning subcommittee stuff.
Summary of citizen recommendations.
Thank you.
Do people need copies of the zoning subcommittee?
I'm not sure where this came from.
Are there any more? Chris, are there more copies? Is everyone on the board? Yeah, I think in order, you don't have it it wasn't in the planning packet, it was in the zoning subcommittee.
I have this
Okay.
thing.
We'll take a
Yep.
short break.
Yeah, I think the official time is like,
The heat of the day.
oh, it's gonna be better.
Oh, yeah. So many people are opposed to like 10 o'clock or
Oh, that price only starts at
$45.
Are you a senior?
Thank you for asking. Whatever the number is, I am.
Okay, good.
60, 62, 65, I mean.
Yeah, and the group that we have is planning on having dinner there.
I don't know, let me see how I am.
Have your GF come?
Yeah. Oh, no, yes, but she doesn't live here. She lives in Hyannis. She's here now. She's going back Saturday morning. She's in Hyannis. She won't be here. She has work on Monday. She won't be here. But no, she would never play with, she's a new golf.
So some people went there just for dinner.
I didn't realize they had a restaurant. I just thought it was, You know, like a pro shop and a trailer.
Apparently, it's a nice little,
I've heard that it's a pretty good course, that it's very tight, it's hilly, it's a long distance from green to tee.
yes, right,
And that, I don't even think you're allowed to walk.
right, right. They have some rules about
This
this.
heat, I played last night at Hickory. I'm subbing this summer, and when we teed off, it was 94 degrees at 5:30. Played in 2 hours, which is fun. But
Yeah, I did that. I played 9 holes at Hickory Ridge at 2 o'clock
oh, you did?
before your league started.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because you have to be off by, well,
Yeah,
5:30.
right. We were going to do 18, but
Yeah.
so we walked 9.
Well, I have only played, it's only the second time I played golf this year, because I had torn a muscle in my hip. So I just played 9 holes a week ago and 9 holes last night. Shot the same score both times.
Yeah.
48's fine.
Good, good.
That's me. Bogey golfer.
I got under 100 a couple of times for the first time, so I'm all excited.
All right. Well, and of course, in a new golf course, we get 10 extra strokes.
That's right.
Oh, is
that's
that right?
Yeah. We're gonna play in the Cold Spring course on Sunday
Oh, okay.
with some of his buddies, seniors.
Special town meeting. Yeah, here we go.
Now, these are the potential, so this is all the stuff that was emailed.
This is the list that they're looking at there.
I'm much more interested in golf.
Oh, I think I have one.
Actually, I can't believe it here. Yeah.
This is just make copies.
You're young, right?
Saying, you can ask, but you know, you got your computer, so you know just to type, you know.
That's right. Thank you.
See all these gray hairs now?
See, I have a reason for bringing my computer to the zone, or to the planning commission every week.
Oh, let's see what's behind that.
You're probably hitting your age now.
Look at that.
You're banned if you look at the map of Boston. And they're saying the best new golf course is Boston.
That's gonna be hard for me.
But you know, new golfers, we always have to go.
Somebody just shot their age on the PGA
Really? I'm a Hickory fan. It's in Amherst.
in Phoenix Golf.
Yeah, I think I'm.
You know, just
At a 63, and they're
oh, yeah. Just play there outside.
Well, thank you very much to the, Ms. Brestrup for making copies of this list. What we have before us now is a list of potential zoning amendments for fall 2012 special town meeting. I will read them off just so that, for the record. Zoning bylaw amendments are, with respect to residential rental use amendments, single-family and duplexes, converted dwellings, lodging and boarding houses, mixed-use, live-work use, rental registration requirement, and a functional family definition. Those are with respect to residential rental uses. The next item is Atkins Corner Village Center zoning revisions, and that's the, and we have a footnote that work on the North Amherst Village Center rezoning will be for spring 2013. Third item, historic preservation amendments / demolition delay extension, change from 12 to 18 months. Next item, sustainable alternative energy and LID requirements.
Low impact development.
Thank you.
Call lid.
Lid requirements. Next item is agricultural processing to be added to the light manufacturing use category. Next item, DEP Zone 1 compliance amendments, a technical fix. Next item, identifying sites for private student housing. This is flagged as a longer-term project. Transfer of development rights, flagged not certain to be ready by fall. And flood-prone conservancy remapping and rezoning, not ready until spring 2013. I'm going to skip the general bylaws amendments because we won't be dealing with those. On the back, we have the residential use definitions that were the first item. Mr. Rosnoy, you had a comment?
Well, Mr. Chair, I was just wondering if it might be appropriate, we've talked about zoning subcommittee and about the continued discussion on the role, and then the next agenda item was public comments, and I think most of the audience who are here have this list, and I'm sort of wondering if now might be a time to insert public comments.
Oh, sure, that's fine with me.
At your discretion, of course.
Yeah, happy to do it. So we'll open the floor to public comment. If you have comments, please direct them to the board, to me, and do your best to be concise, seeing as it's getting late. Please raise your hand if you'd like to come forward, identify yourself, say your piece. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Gretchen Fox. I live at 90 Faring Street, Precinct 10. I'm a town meeting member. And I did have a comment on rental registration, which I already handed in writing because I didn't want to take up the subcommittee's time. But I see that identifying sites for private student housing has sort of attracted my attention, because we think that's really that should be a very strong and high priority, not a longer-term project. The sooner we can identify areas where private student housing might be developed, the better, it seems to me. So I just wanted to say that to the board. It seems to me that it's urgent.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Fox. That sentiment is echoed by a memorandum submitted by Ms. Kruger, that the master plan doesn't identify any areas for additional student housing. So, other public comments? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Maurianne Adams, and I live at 14 Beston Street, Precinct 10. I have a rather detailed statement that I will give out to the group rather than boring you with a read aloud. But I didn't realize the board was so large. I'm sorry about that. I have only 9 copies left, but I'm sure you can handle getting them around to other people. Here are 9 copies at least. This response reflected, I written earlier today and last night, was something I wanted to say to the board in response to the memo from the planning department that talked about the zoning subcommittee process and next steps. In some ways, my attitude has changed slightly as a result of my wonderfully positive experience with the zoning subcommittee this evening at 5 o'clock. I feel that there's a real sea change in the effort to emphasize the rental dilemma and the tilting of neighborhoods to the LLC purchases of houses, delivering them as kind of student rentals. This concern, which has been a neighborhood concern for us for a very long time, and which really made it in past years extremely difficult for us to support other rezoning efforts that would result, in our mind, in more student rentals and private large rental units before we had solved the basic difficulty of managing the landlord and owner permitting process and shifting, as I've indicated elsewhere, the blame from students, and we've had some discussion about that here in the past, shifting the blame from students to the owners and the managers who, after all, profit from these rentals, often to the detriment of our neighborhoods. So that is a fundamental, I feel, sea change in the agenda of the zoning subcommittee this evening, and I'm very cheered by this. So let me say that my document, which in some ways does because I'm trained as a literary scholar, a textual exegesis of this zoning subcommittee statement, I just want to point out a few assumptions that remain in that statement and that I find very troublesome, and I'll just mention them briefly because I've written them in some length. One is the referencing of the short-term citizen concerns or fears that is attributed to us as we voted against some of the zoning amendments. I know that this has been attributed to us in privately in blogs and kind of conversations, but to have this attribution of our motives in a public document is extremely troubling to me. I stubbed my toe on that remark. And I think it reveals a perspective that perhaps some of our public town officials still have, that we are fearful, that we are overly cautious, that we don't have the larger concerns of the town in mind. And I think instead, and what I felt this evening, is the importance that we be able to speak to you frankly from our documented experience on the ground so that that can be part of your vision of planning and moving forward. So that's really my first point. The second point is really related to that. It was a kind of causal relationship between the difficulties we're experiencing with housing and the reluctance of us as town meeting members to support some of the incentives of the planning board in past years. Once again, I think that the problems are much more complex than that document indicated, and I think the attribution of our motives is troublesome. A third issue, which I think is of big concern to the planning board, is that the master plan, which is so much now a foundational document governing all of what we say, has in its most recent version, that is the version that was voted in by the planning board, is a document that, at least to my eyes, again, I'm a textual critic, takes a very different position on core issues of infill and development than earlier versions that were reflected in the Comprehensive Planning Committee survey results of 600 plus citizens. I see this master plan very much as a work in progress, but it has not been fully vetted or widely discussed, either in town meeting or in other well-advertised public venues. And I believe that this failure of public awareness or debate is at least partly responsible for the failures of all of the major rezoning efforts. So the effort in the planning department's document to blame community resistance is, I think, both misleading and simplifying. I think it implies a cavalier attitude to public debate and engagement, and it's something that I see changing and that I heartily hope will change. So my last comment is that, and I'm seeing this happen, that the zoning subcommittee and the planning board responds more actively to the perspective of residents. We're the folks on the ground, at least on one little piece of the ground, that can talk somewhat about what's happening in the town. It's a mistake, as I know you understand, to stereotype our motives or write us off. And I think what we're seeing a sea change toward is involving the full cast of characters who are stakeholders in Amherst's future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Adams. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Sunset Avenue. I hadn't intended to speak, but I wanted to begin to participate in this process as the direct neighbor of a recently converted single-family house, which last year housed 7 students, and a few months ago was given permission to house more than 4. To say it changes the neighborhood is a incredible understatement. This was a single-person house for years. We've lived there for 25 years. The students, although several were arrested late in the year and there's a big party and such, students are not the issue. The landlords are the issue. The absentee landlords are the issue. The landlords who profit enormously are the issue. We're not talking about the people who have one house next door that they own and rent to graduate students. We're talking about major profiteers. And I think it's very important that the town recognize that it is up to you, the Zoning Board of Appeals, you folks, others. And I'm afraid that there's a tendency to take a landlord point of view, at least historically. When I appeared before the Zoning Board of Appeals, 2 of the 3 people there were landlords. They said so. I mean, 2 of the people on the board. One of whom said, if the neighbors didn't want this house rented to students, they should have gotten together and bought it themselves. That's beyond outrageous. One of you was quoted as having said, I don't know who it was, was quoted as having said, we'll approve this because it's near the university and there are a lot of student houses there already. That's outrageous also. I really urge you to take this seriously. This is not just duplexes. This is not mother-in-law apartments. This is not a graduate student who lives in the apartment you have downstairs. This is an organized movement into our community. It's taking away starter homes, homes for retirement, homes for visiting faculty. There's not going to be much of a housing stock left. So I appreciate what Maurianne just said about the paying attention to this. And I hope you do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gromming. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Janet Keller, Precinct 1, town meeting member. I would like to echo some of the comments that you've heard. Very much appreciate the care with which the zoning subcommittee dealt with the issues that were brought before them this evening, and very much appreciate the planning board members who came to that meeting as well. Thank you. And welcome what appeared to be what Maurianne called a sea change. I want to leave you in regard to the pressing need to solve the problems related to housing before any serious consideration can be given in the neighborhoods that are on the periphery of UMass to major rezoning. I do want to say one other thing that still has me concerned, which is perhaps more amorphous and leaves me always in the position of championing a weak issue, environmental concerns. I do not know how to parse the comments I hear from many members of many town officials to continually speak about how the town has saved land in the past. I do understand the squeeze that the town is in with 15% of the land in the hands of the educational institutions. I do understand that it's a town with a lot of wetlands and floodplains that takes up a lot more land. I appreciate that, and I hope that that does not lead to saying we're done with all that. And so I'm looking at this TDR ordinance. I'll be studying that with care and seeing whether or not that can serve as some kind of a mechanism that might be helpful in this regard. But I do want to say that it's no small matter to have 2 ends of town with these major floodplain and wetlands complexes. The more that I look at, North Amherst is the one I'm more familiar with. It looks like a major hydrologic unit that you really have to take into account. I know there's development there, but the water will go where it will. So I just thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Keller. Well, I'm unsure on how to proceed through this agenda.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Rosnoy.
I don't know if it's a motion but I'd recommend that the zoning subcommittee, since it's going to continue and has been newly reconstituted, focus on the whole list that's under residential rental use amendments and consider that a focus of what might be possible to bring to town meeting in November, if necessary, and just hold off on all the other things. I hear the concern about identifying sites for private student housing, and I think that's the reason that's identified as a longer-term project, I believe, is because it is such a big, important project. But there's also the study which is out there, which I think we're counting on getting some information from related to that. So I would not worry about any of the others for town meeting, but I would say the whole list of what's under residential rental use amendments is an important list, and certainly enough for zoning subcommittee to work on. I don't know if you want that as a motion for zoning subcommittee's charge, or that's just my recommendation.
You can always make a motion.
Is it necessary? I don't know. If we can do it by consensus, that's okay.
Yeah, I'd like to hear some more comment first, but.
Sure.
Yes, Mr. O'Keefe.
I guess I would like to echo almost exactly what Richard said. I think that we need to be careful to focus our energy on the issues that are most important to us. And there's a large set of all those individual bullet points under residential use amendments are going to end up being separate zoning articles, I would imagine. And that's a lot for zoning subcommittee to work on, for this board to work on, and for town meeting to understand and process. And I'm really concerned about the fact that it's the middle of July now, and the deadlines do come up pretty quickly for town meeting, and these are all important issues, and we've been hearing over and over again how deeply concerned people are about them. So I think it's important that we focus our effort on those. TDR, which we spent a bunch of time talking about tonight, I think is very important in the longer term. The parenthetical notation here says not certain to be ready by fall. I guess I would just amend that to, in my mind, there's no way that can be ready by fall. We just had the most preliminary possible discussion about it this evening, and again, it's the middle of July, and this stuff needs to be done by the beginning of September, if not a bit earlier than that. And I don't think that we could put together a responsible and coherent TDR set of regulations in the time that's available, given all the other things that we need to be working on. So I would very much argue for us focusing our effort on residential use issues. And the last point I would make is, it's already been mentioned a couple times, but identifying sites for private student housing, while that's an important issue, in my mind, that's not at all an issue for the zoning subcommittee. The zoning subcommittee should be working on zoning issues. They've got enough on their plate. We've got enough just on this piece of paper to keep the zoning subcommittee or this board's zoning efforts in general busy for years in the future. I think that we do need to look at sites for private student housing, but I think that should be a board effort and not a zoning subcommittee effort. I think that's something that deserves our full attention as a board and not just from the subset of the board that's dedicated to zoning.
I'd like to echo Mr. Rosnoy's and Mr. O'Keefe's comments on that. Ms. Ford?
I will also agree on everything that's being said. I think this is absolutely the first priority.
Ms. Kruger?
Yes, echoing, but there's a few things on here that seem like small technical fixes that the board might want to add to the housing list just to have the staff do and come back that are maybe the easy ones, like the DEP Zone 1 compliance. I don't want to just not look at the bottom, the below the line stuff, but I agree about working through that set of housing related zoning amendments in detail, and probably not even doing all of those, but picking which ones. But I think and maybe staff knows which ones are the technical fixes, not necessarily ruling them out.
Mr. Tucker?
I would point first to the one that Ms. Kruger has identified. The one that is labeled DEP Zone 1 compliance is really bringing our zoning into compliance with the Department of Environmental Protection regulations associated with land uses that can occur in the vicinity of surface water public supply areas, Atkins Reservoir in particular. The draft that's been developed for that basically just references the state Commonwealth of Massachusetts regulations. It said don't do anything that these regulations say you shouldn't do. That's essentially what's involved. I would note that the majority of the other non-residential changes here are changes that have been being worked on for a very long time. Both the sustainable alternative energy and LID requirements gets pulled directly out of, with some minor amendments, the form-based village center work, which was worked on for over a year. The same thing with the agricultural processing. That's just adding one use to the light manufacturing category that would enable uses which are supportive of local farming to occur in our centers, in our village centers. So I wouldn't let go of those entirely. Transfer of development rights, I agree absolutely, is not going to be ready for the fall. There are, quite aside from the fact it's easy to write words, there's a whole lot of property transfer information and ways in which you would set up the accounts and so forth that we would have to work through before we would even bring that forward. Let me just take this opportunity to very briefly report on, as I did at the subcommittee meeting, the FPC remapping. We are beginning very quickly, within the next week or so, phase 1 of the floodplain study. That first phase is going to be an examination of the existing information to see which information is accurate enough to go forward and which information will need to be redone and will involve field study and so forth. It's much more complicated than that. It involves discussions with FEMA, but that's basically what it's going to do. That would be done by September, at which point the second phase would begin, which would be developing the new mapping generally. That will have 2 parts again. One part is intended to revise the federal flood insurance rate maps that banks and everybody else use for giving mortgages that identify, according to the federal government standards, what's a floodable area, what's a floodway versus a floodplain, and so forth. We are in discussions with the consultant to do something that FEMA does not address, which is to give us information in a mapped form which makes some kind of responsible projection for changes in flooding on the basis of projected climate change. We may end up not having reliable enough data to do that in a direct way. We may have to do it in some more indirect way, but we want to be able to include that. We don't want to have to change the entire FPC district every 2 years as the climate shifts on us. So that's the status of that. I would also point out that the Historic Preservation Amendments, demo delay extension, that and a number of the other these were, including those in the prospective amendments, is an attempt to begin to address some of the issues that have arisen during the village center process so that we can deal with those before we go back to dealing with the fundamental village center rezoning. In that one, particularly the Historic Preservation Amendments, the demo delay extension, the possibility of extension, or the technicalities involved in extending the delay from 12 to 18 months so that public entities can actually get their gears moving to try and preserve a property would be very simple. It would not be a simple political process, but it would be a very simple technical process. So it's not quite as black and white as it seems. In terms of what's possible, what's not possible. Many things are possible. You have to decide what the priorities are.
Yes, Ms. Ford.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that a lot of how these items get worked through with the zoning subcommittee is that language gets drafted through the planning department. Is that true? And then there's discussion, whatnot. Well, it seems to me with these items that you're just describing as technical fixes, could those be written up? They sound like they're written up. They are written up, and then they just get presented to all of us so that we get, that becomes part of our agenda. So that because it sounds like it's not going to require a huge amount of discussion. I don't know, am I?
You're suggesting that we bypass the zoning subcommittee on those particular
Yeah, that it
items?
comes directly to us in our meeting here, you know, in our agenda, where our zoning subcommittee piece of the meeting, and that, so that the zoning subcommittee can really kind of put their full effort into these housing issues.
Yeah. That's very sensible, I think. Mr. O'Keefe? Please.
I definitely think that's more sensible than spending time in the subcommittee working on them. I would still argue in favor of holding our breath and waiting until spring for even the minor technical issues. We've done without agricultural processing as a separate use category for many years, and it seems to me that we could probably last another 6 months. The DEP Zone 1 compliance, I think maybe a case could be made for that in terms of being in compliance with state law, but anything that's voluntary, I think that we run the risk of diluting our efforts. People only have a certain amount of time and energy and willingness to think about zoning issues, and it's not just drafting them and it's not just talking about them in the subcommittee, but every single article that gets brought to the table at town meeting has a fairly significant infrastructure that goes along with it. We have to have a public meeting at this board. It has to be presented to the select board so that they can vote on it and discuss it. It has to be discussed and explained at a warrant review meeting. It has to be discussed and explained at precinct meetings. It has to be explained on the floor of town meeting. All of those things take time and energy and people's capacity to think about zoning issues. And if we've got a set of issues that we think are important and worth moving forward on with dispatch, then I don't think that it's a good idea to dilute that energy and tolerance for zoning issues by dealing with stuff that is not nearly of the same level of importance.
I absolutely agree with that, Mr. O'Keefe, and I am inclined to put off all the optional items as well and stick to, my opinion would be that we stick to the residential rental use amendments and nothing else for the fall meeting. That would be my preference. Ms. Anderson?
Yeah, you know, and everything that we've heard in this last year of whether it be going out to site plan inspections where we've seen some potential conversions to the members of the public who have come to our meetings, regardless of what topic we're talking about, the drift of the student housing going the direction that it is has always been, just gets in the way of every other topic. And I think we would be very strong in saying to our co-residents of the town that we're listening to people by going right to the, I mean, with these topics right here, people, I would think their attention span is going to be, oh yeah, I want to know about that. You know, I'm like, what about the other floodplain? That sounds interesting, but it bores me. But, you know, we all have rentals around us, and my, you know, I speak from the heart, so, and so I just think that these are pertinent, and I think people would be interested, and I think it would show good faith on the part of the planning board, and I applaud the zoning subcommittee for taking on even those 6 or 7 topics, because they are not just words, there's stuff under that and whatnot. But I think this would be a keeper.
You know, I think one thing that's sort of not being said is we can do these things, and I think they would be great fixes if we can do them. Zoning just doesn't address who can live where, and so we're doing what we can within the scope of changing zoning. We're not the whole picture as far as preventing changes to student housing or being able to you know, stop the parties or the lawn couches, what have you. But we can, the parts that we can do under zoning, I think it makes sense to me to prioritize those.
And Mr. Chair, may I just say one more thing, that at our next meeting, August 1st, we have the health inspector, the building commissioner, and the new position, what's that called? The
Code enforcement.
The code enforcement. Those 3 individuals will be here. It will be an excellent time to ask them, what tools do they need to do? They're out in the field. They see things we don't. You know, what is it that would help them? You know, if they, you know, they have a rule or bylaw they can point to or something? So I think we will get excellent information from them on August 1st to help enhance these topics right here. I'm looking forward to hearing from them myself.
Mr. Tucker.
I would ask that you consider including the DEP Zone 1 compliance amendment, just because it is intended to accompany Board of Health regulations that are in development now. And it will bring us into compliance with state law, which is one of our more pressing priorities.
Can we categorize it under residential rental use amendments?
And in necessary technical fixes.
Yeah, that's right.
And other matters.
Yes, Ms. Kruger.
Very briefly, in taking this course, which I think is a great direction, we're sort of implicitly saying that we're not going to do Atkins Corner rezoning until sometime in the future. And I just wanted to say, rather than, we're so busy now focusing on the residential that Atkins just isn't going to happen. I know we were going to decide about the Village Center rezoning at maybe this meeting or a subsequent meeting soon. And I've decided that I would like to let that go till spring on its own, more specifically, not just because we're focusing on residential stuff, but I think it just warrants us deciding about Atkins or both Village Centers and not just de facto because we picked something else now, and that's just, we don't have time for that now.
Besides, everybody wanted to see how the double rotaries are going to work anyway.
Well, I
for one, can't wait for the darn detour to change.
Oh, my God.
I live on Pomeroy Lane, and that's where they come.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it.
And Atkins may be out of business if we don't
right.
get that detour. They're having a heck of a time, so.
Yeah, please make the effort to get to Atkins.
Atkins, yeah.
Okay, I'm hearing consensus here, and is anybody opposed to addressing the residential rental use amendments and strongly considering the DEP Zone 1? Anybody opposed to that? Okay, DEP Zone 1, I think, my understanding, that could come directly to the board. It doesn't need to go through zoning subcommittee. Is that also the consensus?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, excellent. We look forward to progress on both fronts.
If I may?
Yes, Ms. Brestrup, yes.
Before you go on to another topic, I just want to be clear about how to prepare the agenda for the next meeting. There were a number of options presented to you about how you would incorporate zoning into your planning board meetings, and Mr. Schreiber proposed at the zoning subcommittee meeting that you might consider meeting earlier in the evening at 6:30 and have an hour devoted to zoning. So that's one option. Another option is to have your meeting at 7 like you do now and have an hour devoted to zoning, so that would be 7 to 8. So how would you like to proceed? Or the other option would be to do what you did tonight and have certain items come first, and then maybe the third item would be zoning. So I just want to be clear from you, because to let you know, Jonathan and I are not going to be here next week. We're not going to the same place, but we're going to 2 different places. And we need to publish the agenda for the August 1st meeting on Monday.
Well, any ideas from the board on that? Yes, Mr. O'Keefe.
I would express a preference in favor of a structure similar to what we have tonight, with a agenda item under old business called zoning, which would consist of a report from the zoning subcommittee followed by a discussion amongst the board of the status of various issues.
Mr. Schreiber, did you?
The only thing is that, when we have public hearings, they can go on 4 hours. So to actually get to old business can be 10 o'clock. And so really pretty much everyone here has been here since 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
Are we having public hearings at the next meeting now?
No, but just as an overall structure for the board.
Ms. Ford?
I have no objection to meeting at 6:30 and doing the hour. I mean, if we need a consensus on that, I'm okay with that.
6:30 is tough for me. I don't know how it is for other people, but I could, if that's what the board wants to do, I'll get here for 6:30.
If I may, you have another option, and that is to, at your next meeting, you will not have a public hearing, so you could replicate tonight's agenda format. When we know we're going to have a public hearing coming up, we can, at the previous meeting, discuss where we're going to place things on the agenda, and just keep it as an item that is clearly identified for everybody who would be interested in what's going on in terms of its timing.
Just to be clear that it's going to be on the agenda every meeting from now through fall town meeting.
Right.
Mr. Rosnoy?
If we were to meet at 6:30, would that truncate the zoning subcommittee meeting from 5 to 6:30? Because really, I know you're supposed to be 5 to 6:30, but you go to 7. It just seems like the zoning subcommittee now has a lot to do, and I think you're going to need that time.
I'll just chime in on that if we keep the planning board at 7 and we're taking some of the load off of the zoning subcommittee, they could actually have a half an hour off from 6:30 to 7 to get some coffee and something to eat.
No, I move against that.
I'm going to cater.
That would be my inclination, would just be to kind of keep things on that keel. Ms. Anderson?
Yeah, yes, my preference would be for the next meeting on August 1st, under appearances, to hear our 3 guests, after the minutes and whatever else we have to do for housekeeping, but to have them be first, because they may be very informative about the next topic of zoning. So I'd like to have them, plus, you don't want them to wait. So keep their special guests first. Or if we have, I don't know what else we have on the agenda, buildings so far.
The only other thing I think is that Amir Makachi's coming in to talk about his project.
That's correct. Yeah. McCutcheon, Mr. Weber says that's it is pronounced.
He's never said that.
How does he pronounce it?
He hasn't. He's never objected to a mispronunciation, is the wonderment I'm having.
I could be wrong, too.
Make sure to ask him to identify himself when he appears before us.
And then we'll have it on the record. Okay. For those who aren't following along at home, he owns the Auto Express over by Cumberland Farms in East Amherst and is proposing some changes over there. Okay. Yes, Ms. Brestrup.
May I say that I just put the planning board rules and regs on the agenda because I wasn't sure if you were tabling it until tonight or tabling it till some future date. So if you wish to table it to a future date, that's perfectly fine.
Well, let's talk about it briefly, because in order to determine that, we're going to have to talk about it. There are 2 planning board rules and regulations changes. One would require the submittal of a lease with some language to be included, possibly, at a minimum, to just require that a copy of the lease be provided with any submittals for permit applications. And the second being that the applicant provide a completed rental unit registration form to be submitted to the Board of Health. Those were 2 things that we can do under our own auspices to try and just tighten up the submittal requirements and let applicants know what they need to give us when they're applying for residential rental uses. We've had some comment from staff that potentially putting the language about no sofas into the rules is a little too much, that we should just keep that. We can always add it as a condition when we grant the permit. I'm inclined to agree, just in terms of keeping the rules simple. So as far as the language on here, my proposal would just state, for any residential rental use, submittal of 1, a copy of the lease to be used, and section 2 would remain the same as it is there.
Can I move that we consider that? Is that proposed language tonight?
Is there any objection to working on this real quick tonight before we move on? Ms. Brestrup?
You do.
Yes, please come forward and state your name.
Paige Wilder, Precinct 10. I live on Fearing Street. Julie Fetterman of the Health Department is working on best practices leases and best practices management plans. And since they're coming next week, you might want to hear what she has to say about it before talking about new leases.
Mr. Tucker? Thank you very much. Ms. Wilder?
If I may, that was why staff was saying, let's not get specific about what a lease should include, because we're in the process of developing a best practices lease. Rather, we should simply ask if we're going to amend your rules and regulations, which, by the way, would require you to hold a public hearing to do that, but no, you then would, if you approved of what you did, you would amend the regulations yourselves. A simple reference would then enable us to use some best practices lease that got developed, rather than having to have the contents of that and its specifics in your rules and regulations.
Having heard this, still want to proceed tonight? Mr. O'Keefe?
I guess I would like to proceed just to the extent of agreeing that we should go ahead, essentially, as you propose, striking this specific language, and just go ahead and schedule a public hearing as soon as reasonably possible. It doesn't seem that it's useful to have much discussion about it at this point outside the context of a public hearing.
Agreed. Shall we schedule a public hearing to amend our planning board rules and regulations?
Could do that for the 15th,
August 15th.
I believe. Chris, is that correct?
Do we need 2/3 or anything like that for that?
No.
No.
Okay. All right. So that was the shortened version of little I. All right, great. Next is the summer schedule. I'm not sure how much there is to do on that, except for we've sort of touched on it several times. Ms. Brestrup, is there anything more?
Nothing more.
Okay.
So just to confirm, August 1st and 15th. And have we made a decision on August 29th regarding that? I'm looking, remember the grid sheet that we all had, and it's bolded, which is why I'm asking.
Anyone whose first name ends in A has to come to the meeting that night.
Oh, I like that. Second.
Think about that one first.
That's how we're going to handle the workload.
I rescind my comment.
The old gas rationing days.
Ms. Brestrup?
Would you mind tabling that discussion until future? Because I know of one potential site plan review application that we might get in, and it's for town work, and I won't say any more than that, but it may be very important to have it done really quickly.
I suggest that we table the issue of the the 3rd August meeting. Mr. Tucker?
Just a quick note about zoning subcommittee meetings. They are noticed as meetings of the Amherst Planning Board and zoning subcommittee. So any member of the board may attend at any time if they are interested in a specific issue. It can be, in essence, a meeting of the full board as well as the subcommittee. That's the way it's set up. So those who have particular interests can arrive and depart, or arrive and stay and get caught up in the swamp.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Any other topics not reasonably anticipated 48 hours prior to the meeting? Hearing none? Oh.
When are we going to, it occurs to me that we have 9 members here and 3 members just appointed. That normally we would do elections at some point soon.
If I may, you need to notice that.
Okay.
And as an item on the meeting agenda, that's not something you can sort of just take up. Unfortunately.
But we can talk about when to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, you could.
How about August 1st?
Is everyone here August 1st?
No?
I'm not here.
Who's not here?
I'm not here.
Is everyone here the 15th?
I'm not here.
I would propose that we do it in September then.
I'm not here, no.
September 5th?
September 5th.
Is that good?
Yeah.
I won't be here the 19th.
September 5th is our, barring future changes. Okay. Thank you. Good point, Mr. Schreiber. Moving on to new business. We have an item called housing, and the first item on that agenda is comments of Mr. John Fox on public input into the housing market study. Mr. Fox.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weber. John Fox, Precinct 10. I live on Fearing Street, and I'm a member of town meeting. As you know, I have a major concern about the proposed comprehensive housing market needs study. But I would like to begin preliminarily by echoing comments by Maureen Adams about the change of really the whole sense of the planning board and its relations to the public. It is really wonderful to see how much you have heard us and listened to us in a genuine way. Perceptions in the past have been that we're just talking by each other. Nobody hears what the different sides are saying. And there's also the perception reflected in town meeting that things have been rushed forward, not adequately vetted. And I think that the discussions that you've had, Mr. O'Keefe's very careful articulation of why it's important to really focus on things that can be vetted and really can be explained, really will help the process. Because it's really my hope, and I know it's yours, that we can come together on these things. We're not going to agree on everything, but that we can do a much better job of coming together. So I see this as a real opportunity, and I want to thank you for what I think is really a change. I hope we continue along this line. So let me just now give you my concern, and you've seen the exchange of letters. And I'll read to you what I have here. You previously received the exchange of comments between Mr. Tucker and me and Stephanie O'Keefe and me. The latter is attached, by the way, to my statement. I have a copy here if you haven't seen it. These exchanges were triggered by the failure of the RFP to require community-wide input, such as a series of charrettes or focus groups, as occurred in connection with Gateway and North Amherst. I have been arguing that the consultant understand the extraordinarily complex housing data, to assess and synthesize that data, and to make predictions and recommendations about it. The consultant must engage all elements of the larger Amherst community. This must include the people who live in our diverse neighborhoods and know so much about what is happening on the ground, the data, strengths, challenges, and vulnerabilities of where they live. I guess nothing was more impressive than Rolf Karlstrom's account of what's been happening on Fearing Street that really only somebody who lives in our neighborhood could do as persuasively. And let me just mention as a side, I was thinking about this, that I had a very good friend who worked for the World Resources in Washington, who was a leading environmental economist. And he was trying to understand why the sides, those who didn't believe in climate change, those who did, were so divided. So he did a study of what divided them. And he found, interestingly, that 80% of the issues they actually agreed upon. And 10% they weren't all that much opposed to. It was 10% of the issues that really divided them. I suspect that if we really continue this conversation, that we can find there's so much more agreement than any of us really recognize because we've been sort of shouting at each other and not engaging each other. So let me move on. Because I believe excluding the charrettes, excluding public participation, is really a step backwards from what I see is a real step forward. The argument against such public input was succinctly put by Ms. O'Keefe in her July 9th email to me. Quote, "This study," she said, "is fundamentally different from the Gateway and Village Center charrette processes. Those were about visioning, while," and note well her comment here, "this is about collecting numerical and market data. public input related to future policy decisions will more appropriately flow from the study results rather than informing its results, end quote. As Mr. Tucker explained in his email to me of the same date, quote, the purpose of this study, as opposed to a policy-making process, is to gather, assess, and synthesize the meaning of empirical data, census data, housing sales, regional and national trends, etc., he said, end quote. In other words, to quote that famous line from Dragnet, quote, just the facts, man. So now I'm asking for the opinion of each member of the planning board. Is this RFP, which you have before you, just about the facts, objective data? And before you answer that, let's look at the plain language of just a few of the details of what the consultant is to provide that appear on the very first page. To complete a projection of market conditions over the next few years. That's not data, that's a whole set of processes of evaluating data and making estimates, an analysis of the impact of the student rental market on Amherst's overall housing stock. An analysis, it's not just presenting data. But here's the smoking gun, if you need a smoking gun. And last but not least, this is right from the RFP. The consultant is to review existing zoning and general bylaws pertaining to housing and make recommendations regarding currently proposed and future amendments to said bylaws addressing housing needs in Amherst. That's not data collection. That's not census work. That's policy. That's the heart of what we've been fighting about. And you're asking the consultant to provide that guidance. Could anything be clearer? So I have a question for you. Did you encourage the planning department to write this RFP so as to exclude, all of the charrettes or other focus groups or, town-wide participation? As we had in Gateway, which was so significant in Gateway, which really changed the outcome of Gateway because of what the consultant learned. And I gather the consultant here, the potential ones are from out of town, maybe somebody from Boulder, Colorado, people who are not intimately involved in knowledge of the various neighborhoods. So Mr. Weber, maybe I can ask you, did the planning board vote or advise the planning department to exclude charrettes, focus groups, other ways of engaging the broad public of Amherst? Is there an answer to that question? I mean, did the planning board advise the planning department in drafting the RFP to eliminate any charrettes, any focus groups, any of the kinds of things that we saw in the Gateway study, the North Amherst study?
Mr. Fox, I didn't really come here to be interrogated tonight.
Well, I wondered because there's a statement by Mr. Tucker that judgment was made in consultation with the planning board, and I wondered whether that was really true. I mean, maybe I don't mean to interrogate you. I wondered whether that statement was true. That's all.
It's the first time I've heard that statement. I don't have any basis for evaluating it. The planning board discussed it. Mr. Tucker?
I think I can speak to, I think there's a misunderstanding of what number 4 is about there. It reads, review of existing zoning and general bylaws pertaining to housing. Have the consultant look at our existing regulations and make recommendations regarding currently proposed and future amendments. That is to say, amendments that have already been developed or are in some form. Look at those in the context of the housing data and give us recommendations about them. That is not the development of amendments. That is a set of technical recommendations in light of the housing data created that then goes to the planning board, the zoning subcommittee, and forward from there through a public process. Nothing goes anywhere until there's a public process.
Can I jump in just for a minute? Can anyone on the board or from staff just remind us all and the viewers at home about how this RFP and the housing study in general, what the genesis of it was, and who, just the sort of the history of how this came about?
In light of the very conversation, community dialogue that Mr. Fox is describing, last summer, staff and eventually the planning board and others developed a proposal to ask for funds to do a housing study so that the kinds of policy decisions being asked to be made around this general and rather inflammatory issue could be made in the context of real data. Funds were requested from the fall town meeting. Town meeting appropriated those funds. We then went through a process of, because the village center zoning had not gone forward at the fall, and the priority of the planning board and others was to try and revise that and bring that forward. That was the focus of effort. Staff worked on an RFP in the interim. During the spring of this year, that RFP, or a draft form of it, was brought to the planning board and brought to the zoning, to the select board for their review and comments. We took those review and comments from both bodies, and as instructed by the town manager, in the context of all of this, we developed a final version of the RFP, and it went out in late May. We awaited responses through June. We got responses in early July. There were two, and we are currently reviewing those responses in the context of this.
Ms. Kruger?
I just went back to the RFP under meetings, and it says the consultant shall meet a total of 3 times with the Housing and Shelter Committee in public sessions. So it was my understanding that those meetings would be an opportunity for public comment and input. I was a little confused with this part because it seemed like this housing market study was kind of a planning board initiative coming out of Gateway and other discussions at town meeting, the whole history I'm not going to go into. And this is a new committee, but there were people in town government who felt that it rested with them. So I think that the public process is really, with the Housing and Shelter Committee, I think there should always be a public process. Nothing is just data. So I kind of agreeing with your point, but I think the arena for it is with that committee at this point, because this is sort of what the consultant is bidding on X number of meetings as described. So I think it's always better to err on the side of additional public comment and participation than less, but is that not, it's not enough to have those meetings?
Well, I would argue that this is a brand new, very small, very focused committee. There are 5 members of this committee. It was just formed, just 5 members. And to choose that committee as the vehicle for inviting townwide comment minimizes the invitation, because their focus is, and you know the charter, to deal with, I mean, it's a very good charter, deal with homelessness and, the difficulty of affordable housing in town. Now, that's a legitimate interest, but that is a mere piece of the larger thing. So let me just come back to the larger theme here. I think this housing study is really important. I'm in favor of it because I believe it is really a chance for us to learn from everyone, not just residents, but business interests, official interests, lots of interests, but absolutely from people who live in the neighborhoods, who really know what's going on in those neighborhoods in a way that nobody else knows. So to give this housing study the kind of significance to be a truly informed study by a consultant who just doesn't look at GPS and census data and then talk to the Housing and Shelter Committee and officials of the town, but for the public to feel you really heard them, as they did in Gateway, which was really a bringing together process. I strongly encourage you to bring into this process what works so well in these other in the Gateway process. So I hope it will be reconsidered.
I think we all hear you loud and clear and I hope that we've started addressing those concerns, at least as far as the planning board is concerned, as far as trying to change things to broaden public comment and to listen to public concerns and to move rezoning and what we can do for housing issues in a direction that, you know, meets up with the public needs. I also hear you that you're concerned that there's not enough opportunity for public comment under this RFP.
Yes.
I think that the results of that RFP and that the results will be presented without having adequate input from the public.
Yes.
Correct?
And I think that would be just a great shame, because this is really an opportunity. It's a great opportunity. We don't have that much money to do. It's always controversial. How do we spend so much money on consultants? And so it would be a great shame if coming out of this is not the opportunity for the consultant to really hear from residents who live in all neighborhoods. I'm not talking about Fearing Street. I'm talking about neighborhoods across the town.
I think just for the record, this RFP has been put out already, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't think it can be withdrawn or changed at this point. The RFP itself, I mean, it's a document that's already been published. So with that in mind, I mean, I think that I'll take comments from the rest of the board at this point if anybody wants to chime in. But yeah, Mr. Schreiber, yeah.
I respectfully disagree that there are all kinds of ways of soliciting public participation. And I think that the charrette is a particular way of synthesizing, of bringing together ideas after data has been collected. And so I think that I see this as that first stage of really analyzing. And it's not at the stage where it's ready to, it will be used to inform future zoning changes and to inform the planning process. So I would also respectfully ask that you participate in this in good faith and not have any kind of expectation that this is a flawed process, because I don't see it that way.
In the back, would you like to come forward? Ms. Wilder?
I do respectfully disagree with that, and I think you're going to lose a lot of confidence coming
Mr.
out
Fox,
of that.
could you let Ms. Wilder speak, please?
I don't know if John was done, and I would appreciate him having more time to continue what he was saying if he does, but I would like to add a little prehistory to what Mr. Tucker said. You all heard Mr. Karlstrom speak tonight. He was very concerned about the gateway process that had no facts and figures. He met with a huge neighborhood group, which extended to a larger community group. It was hundreds of people that discussed problems with Gateway, and we came up with the idea that there needed to be a study. That's where the study came from. Many of us now feel that it's been hijacked, that it was an opportunity to be heard about the limitations of the Gateway charrette, and now it's no longer that opportunity. To take a zoning thing, as Connie has said, and put it into housing homeless people makes no sense at all. And none of us even knew that they were handling it or that there were hearings. So I really think the process has been limited, and in terms of building trust and hearing the public, it's devastating, and it won't help anything go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wilder. I know that I'll speak from my own perspective. When this was presented to us, and in context, my vision of it was more like a census than anything else. And I didn't envision having any input into it myself, never mind public. I was envisioning the consultant sort of taking an inventory of what we have. After hearing the language quoted by you, Mr. Fox, I can see that we're asking for some analysis as well. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to have an outside third party commenting on it. I don't think that's innately bad.
I think we want that. And I think you're asking for it. I mean, I haven't quoted all this, but you're asking for lots of opinions, projections, the rest. I think that's essential. I want that. I absolutely want that. But I believe that for it to be a really reliable, well-informed process, that you need to put the neighborhood organization, you need to call for neighbors to get together and meet with the consultant, so the consultant hears about these things. There's no such thing as data in a box or census data that is going to do this. You can't go to a GPS. this is a really organic thing. These are full of controversies and different perceptions. And if you haven't heard the neighbors across Amherst on these issues, then I think it's a flawed study. So, we disagree with I disagree with Mr. Schreiber, but I hope some of you will see this point, and I think it is a part of trust. I think we will feel that we have been heard. It doesn't mean that he's going to agree with us or whoever it is. There's a real give and take here. But if there isn't a give and take, I think it's something that fundamentally is missing.
I want to just point out that it's getting late. Mr. Rosnoy?
Yes, Mr. Fox, I want you to be sure that we hear you. I think all of us hear you. And earlier in your presentation, you talked about previously how we have been speaking past each other.
Yes.
And so I hope you don't take a disagreement of your perspective as talking past each other. We hear you, but the fact that we may respectfully disagree with you, it does not mean that we're talking past each other. I tend to concur with my colleague, Mr. Schreiber, and saying that at a certain point, an impartial third party conducting a study from a professional perspective, I disagree with your portrayal of it as census data. Presumably, we're hiring a professional who's got a lot of experience dealing with housing markets and current situations in certain types of neighborhoods, and what the data may tell regionally, perhaps nationwide, perhaps municipally, about future projections from that data. So it's not just a census study, and but it's also not, they are not going to be making policy for the town. After we get the information from these professionals and they do a thorough job, and we have opportunity, as Mr. Schreiber said, I also hope that you will, in good faith, and all of your colleagues will participate in the process, regardless of what the board or body is that the town has designated as the focus of getting the information. Because certainly there'll be a lot of opportunity for you to provide input at those meetings. But after we get all of that information and the data that these professionals come up with, then we will have more of a basis to go forward with our zoning recommendations to town meeting, which is what town meeting has asked us to do.
Ms. Adams, did you have a comment?
Just very brief.
Please come forward.
Very brief. Maureen Adams, Precinct 10. I wonder, since there have been 3 meetings allocated to this specific committee, which has possibly a jurisdiction, but a limited jurisdiction, and that's already written into the RFP, is it not possible to take 1 or 2 of those meetings and amplify the public forum dimension of it and diminish the committee dimension of it, so there will not be more than 3 public meetings, but one of them will really be more designated and widely disseminated as something for the public to speak at.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. I think that that's something you could certainly take up with that committee. Unfortunately, we are not that committee.
As the liaison to that committee.
Yes, Ms.
Liaison to that committee. I think with Ms. Adams' suggestion, maybe if there is a lot of public interest and board interest in that topic, that as we did with the Community Development Committee last year, maybe we would offer to co-host a public meeting with that committee in, at a time and a place separate from their regular meeting where people would come in the evening. So maybe if they were open to that, we could offer that. They don't have to take that to kind of co-host with them a larger public session.
That's certainly something we could do.
I think that's an excellent idea.
Ms. Brestrup?
I just wanted to point out in response to something that Ms. Wilder said, that this study, it's actually 2 studies, and the first of them is a housing production plan, which is being funded by Community Development Block Grant funds, and it is collecting a lot of data about housing in town, but it is the result of it for task 1 is supposed to be the preparation of a housing production plan, which is something that towns do in response to Chapter 40B to try to establish a pattern or a plan for moving ahead to create affordable housing, so that the state will, what should I say, sort of cooperate with them when and if a comprehensive permit is, you know, presented to them. It allows towns to move towards 10% affordable housing, which Amherst is already over the 10%, but it allows towns to move at a certain pace towards 10% affordable housing. We may fall below the 10% as a result of some housing going off the affordable rolls in the next year or so. So we may be faced with the possibility of being below 10%, and the Housing Production Plan establishes how we propose to get back up to 10% and over 10% in the future. So that's really what Task 1 is about, in addition to gathering data. And that's, what should I say, is geared towards trying to provide homes for people who are low income and potentially homeless. So perhaps that's where Ms. Wilder got that impression about the whole study. And that the three next parts of it have to do with market study and studying how student housing affects housing in town and looking at zoning regulations. So there are really two parts to it, Task 1 and then Tasks 2 through 4.
Thank you, Ms. Brestro. Assuming that we can work with the Housing Committee to do a joint meeting or to attend one, I guess it appears to me that the changes you're proposing are doable within the context of this RFP. Seeing that it can't be rewritten. Thank you very much for bringing it to our attention. I think this has been a very useful discussion. The housing study is extremely important to us as a board. We've made decisions tonight based on waiting for it to come in, and we'll be looking forward to the results as eagerly as anyone. Thank you very much.
Hands full from the top.
I don't think that's on the agenda.
What's the frequency, Dan?
Foreign invaders.
That's
somebody's baby monitor.
Could be Emily Dickinson. All right. Item 2 under new business is A2 is schedule and frame discussion about housing issues. I think that we've adequately covered that, unless someone has an item that I've overlooked.
Ms. Kruger had submitted a statement about how she proposed that you approach housing issues. So would you like me to put that on the agenda for your next meeting, or would you prefer to discuss it now?
Well, I'm a little frustrated because I don't really want to have a conversation at 10 o'clock tonight, and I did put some energy into framing this, and we've waited. We have talked about pieces of it, and I think maybe having sent this out today, it has informed some of our conversation. One frustration is how we even form our agendas for our meetings, so we know, so I looked at this agenda and thought by the time we get to the housing conversation, there's not going to be a lot of wind left in anyone's sails. I took a kind of bad attitude on the wind and solar discussion because I was like chunked into our agenda, and each thing that got added, I saw the housing conversation kind of disappearing over the sunset. What I've tried to do is figure out a role for the planning board in housing, and I think we have it in part with some of the zoning conversations and our role in zoning. But watching conversations across the community, around town meeting, the listserv and different things, it seems like there's kind of a vacuum in who's taking the lead. And I know there's a housing and sheltering committee, but I think that is really focused on affordable housing. And I think the planning board has this opportunity to look at how the campuses are planning for housing and bring people together around that in some way, to look at where does student housing go. And I don't exactly know how you take that on, but I think that's been one of the real challenging pieces. So while we may ask the campuses to provide more housing, we also haven't zoned for rental housing in over 40 or 50 years. So for me, I see a partnership, working with the campuses to see where they can expand and should expand, and where can the town figure out a way. I never saw the Village Center rezoning as a student housing initiative. Some people have talked about University Drive. It's kind of been thrown out because maybe there isn't enough resistance there. So we could do, so I see that we have a role there, but how do we really operationalize our role around housing, which is touching so many facets of everything that we do? So I tried to frame a conversation, and we have touched on it, and I don't know where to go. People have any other comments? We've talked a lot about housing tonight, but I'm just frustrated with time, because it isn't the time to start this and pull the strands together. So if my colleagues have any comments on these bullet points, or a way to find direction in all of this, I just welcome that.
Mr. Tucker?
I would very much urge the board to put this on another agenda so that you can take the time early enough in the evening to go over this. This, in some ways, is the framework for the rest of what is both uplifting and frustrating around all of our efforts to go forward with any number of initiatives, much less about housing. I would point out, and this, I guess this refers back to the earlier comments, and this does not explain everything. It's just a very simple fact. Between 2000 and 2010, Amherst added 85 occupied units. We built more than that, but in terms of occupied units, we added 85. The town's population grew by nearly 3,000 residents. If you look back at housing production over the decades, it rose and fell with the expansion of the university and the economy. In the last decade or more, it has stagnated largely. The decade before this, we saw mostly large, expensive single-family residences. We did get some affordable housing development during this last decade that is not well recognized in those numbers. But the point is that Amherst has, for whatever reason, and I don't want to respond directly to some of the comments earlier, but for whatever reason, Amherst has resisted allowing new development of any kind anywhere near anyone. And the consequence of that is the pressure mounts and it has nowhere to go. And one of the places it has left to go is where there is existing supply. If you have an economy that makes it advantageous for single-family residences to be converted to rentals or to duplexes or to whatever, that's where it will go. You squeeze the balloon, it has to go somewhere. So this is an issue, whether you're talking about production, whether you're talking about quality of life, this is an issue that is central to what you're going to be able to do during your tenure on this board and in the next decade for the community as a whole. So we need to get our heads around this, and I would very much urge that you set aside time to start talking about this.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Ms. Kruger, I'm afraid I didn't understand the nature of your comments and the scope of how you wanted to discuss them. It didn't appear that way to me from the agenda, that this was your item. And I would have, I agree that we need to bring it up earlier in a meeting so we can have a comprehensive discussion.
Mr. Chair, if I might, do you review the planning board agendas before they're finalized?
I will occasionally get questions from staff about whether to put an item on the agenda or not. There wasn't anything specific about your comments that were related to a specific agenda item that I recall. Mr. Tucker?
Most of the time, the agenda is determined by, is there a public hearing upcoming. We have deadlines within which that has to happen, and the rest of it remains more or less the same unless an issue is raised by citizens or the board, people who want to put things on the agenda.
So, for instance, Mr. Fox specifically asked for time
Exactly.
to talk about the input into the housing market study tonight, and I was asked whether they should add that to the agenda.
So you didn't realize that this was the time we were going to talk about housing?
I didn't-
Over the summer that we had postponed from.
I didn't understand that your statement was an agenda item for the planning board. I thought it was in the context of the zoning subcommittee
No,
or.
last meeting I said I will try to frame the conversation because people said housing's a really big topic and what do you want us to do with it? And I said I will come up with something to help us focus our conversation. So for me, that was a large housing discussion, which in a way we had anyway around zoning and other things, but I just kept seeing, maybe I wasn't clear, my agenda item moving further into the.
Yeah, I wasn't, I'm really sorry, I didn't understand at all. Apologize. Ms. Brestrup?
I think that some of these items were established a while ago. For instance, having PVPC come and speak about transfer of development rights, and while they were here to introduce the idea of solar and wind bylaws. And the CDBG Advisory Committee asked about a month and a half ago if they could come in mid-July to talk to you. And then you have your item to review things related to conditions and et cetera, and you asked to have the zoning discussion early in the meeting. And so everything can't be early in the meeting, especially, when things are coming in later. And so you had talked about scheduling and framing a discussion about housing issues. And that is something that we put on the agenda. And a related item was Mr. Fox talking about the housing market study. So, it's a balancing act to put together one of these agendas. And, I guess I can't really say, I'm not apologizing for the way it turned out, because this is just kind of the way things came into the planning department. So one strategy is that, we could send the agenda to Mr. Weber for his approval before we publish it. Sometimes we're making changes up until the last minute because, things come in. So if you would like to see the agenda, say like Wednesday or Thursday of the week before the planning board meeting, we can send it to you.
I mean, I'm not sure I would always get back to you on it. I would certainly try to. I don't see myself as necessarily the only one setting agenda. I primarily, like the rest of you, rely on staff to create the agenda. Yes, Ms. Ford?
So I just want to bring it back to the issue of us as a board discussing housing issues. And, I think it is important, but I'd like to be proactive about it right now too and say that it's timely. I mean, I know this is something that is near and dear and an area of expertise for you, so it's fantastic that you're putting this together and framing it, and it's perfect timing. I'm not even sure, it might even be premature for us kind of in a really general way. I mean, I think starting early fall is perfect, a little bit before the market study or the housing study comes in, as the zoning subcommittee is discussing these various issues. It's really timely. So my vote would be for one of our early September meetings to make this the focus of that meeting. Get it on the agenda now. Great timing.
Any objections to that at all? I certainly don't. I think that's a great idea.
Have a meeting, have a planning board meeting that the topic is housing. And it can be discussion, future, it can be the zoning subcommittee, it can be everything. It just have to have housing as, it doesn't have to do with wetlands, it doesn't have to do with solar.
Well, we're establishing our groundwork for how to then plug in all this information that's going to be coming along all fall and as we move through the year,
That's
right?
fine, as long as we know that it's it's not
Yeah.
gonna just get bumped by public hearings or other people who wanna come talk about their issue. Okay.
September 5th and 19th are our regular meeting dates, according to my calendar. What preference, Ms. Kruger?
Either one of those are.
Since there's a slight possibility I might not be here for the 5th, I will vote for the 19th.
Some people may still be away.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's Labor Day weekend, so.
Yep.
Okay,
do it.
so the 19th?
Yep.
All right, and let's have it be the first item on the agenda, irrespective of permitting, if we can. Ms. Brestrup?
And irrespective of zoning, which you've already said you wanted to have as first on the agenda.
We didn't say that, actually.
Said we'd change it.
Someone did.
We'll sort it out.
We'll address that.
I'll send it to you and you can.
Well, flip a coin, it doesn't matter to me.
Whatever, we'll
Speaker's
figure it out.
Mr. Carson?
I wonder if this would also be a time to ask somebody from the university to come and talk with us again?
I think we've had a request to, and the board requested that we invite university folk, including possibly the chancellor, to come to speak to the board. I think if the purpose of this discussion is to try and get a handle on what the planning board's role should be and what it should do going forward with regard to housing, having a significant presentation or presence of someone else, we would just jangle things up. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it soon prior to that or afterwards, but I would recommend that you have it sort of be a working session, so the fewer distractions, the better.
Okay.
Is that okay, Mr. Carson?
Sure.
Well, I think it's a good idea to bring someone in again, but focus this particular session on framing it. Okay. It being 10:15, we do have a couple items. Ms. Brestrup?
A&R. We have to do an A&R tonight because it
Okay.
is, today is day 20, I think.
Okay.
Okay, so let's do it.
Okay.
Such a kick out of A&R.
What's that?
I was just saying I get such a kick out of A&R, approval not required.
Yeah, well, I'll explain this one here, and then I'll walk around with the plan. This is another one of those ones on Flat Hills Road that I know Rob is particularly interested in. It's one of the W.D. Cole's properties, and they have asked to have 2 lots taken out of Chapter 61 and created as frontage lots so far in the past year and a half, and now they're asking for a 3rd one. This one is the most far northerly of all of the lots, and I have a plan that shows where this thing is, and I will bring it around the actual A&R map.
I'll just make a couple of comments while she's bringing that around. I've actually been working on some legal research around A&R issues right now, and what is an A&R exactly, and what is our planning board's role with A&R. And it's called an endorsement, is what we're doing right now. And what we're saying is that because, and it's considered by the courts to be a purely ministerial role, by endorsing a plan as approval not required, what we're saying is this is not a subdivision. Subdivision is defined as requiring new road construction. So we're saying that the existing frontage and access are adequate. That's it. That's the sole purpose of the A&R.
And having said that, now approval is not required once we've certified those facts.
It's not, approval is not required under the subdivision bylaw.
So it's an abbreviation for approval not required under.
Right.
Subdivision approval not required, but they leave out the word subdivision.
Right.
And that's why it's so.
That's why it's so.
Like an oxymoron.
So these lots have adequate frontage and.
They do, yeah.
They are on a public way.
On a public way, there were 2 already, and this one is the one, the northerly one, which is this one here.
Okay.
And by adequate access, you mean there isn't a road and then a gully or a crevasse in front, but you can actually get onto the site?
Correct.
Well, sometimes we've been asked to define
Is that
what
blurry, or is that my eyes?
appropriate way is.
We did do that
Oh, I
over in,
see.
we had one where we looked
This
at the
one right
way.
here?
Oh, right.
Which is the one we're doing tonight, this one? we're doing?
No, the one, yeah, you could mark this better, but the new one is north of this yellow one.
Oh.
These are the.
But
two
still,
previously-
Massachusetts
Oh,
is
I see,
unique
so this one is
in
up in here?
that,
Yeah, it's right there.
you know,
Oh,
in
okay.
many
And
states,
so
like even a modest
why-
subdivision of land still requires a public hearing.
I used to live right here.
Did you?
Right there. So, it's-
So
Okay.
you're probably gonna see this coming out of chapter 61.
I'll,
I think it is in
Okay.
chapter 61.
what days are you gonna be gone, Rob?
This area here. Not the yellow one north of that.
So,
The subdivision line
One has already been approved. It's
is
this
kind
one.
of, it is an oddity.
And the two that have been taken out.
They've
were
already-
created recent zones, one and this one, and the new one is.
Yeah.
prepared.
they've already sold that one?
They've tried to reform, they've been trying to reform it for years.
I know, worked on it
Thanks.
Really?
Including,
Meetings in the State House.
basically, getting rid of it.
I think it's a dead issue.
I don't know which of these plans works better.
We're stuck with
Political capital
48
to-
forever.
Sounds like it.
All right, let me just look here. If anyone, I'm gonna just open it up as far as, the following items. The letter from the PVPC, Planning Commissioners Journal, upcoming applications of any kind and subcommittee reports. I'm gonna be signing for a few minutes here.
No, you go. No report.
No report.
Nature abhors a vacuum. I want to announce a very important matter for your consideration. That is that this coming Saturday at Look Park in Northampton, the Glasgow Land Scottish Festival will be held.
We'll be in a skirt.
Those of you who do not attend will not ever be able to be eligible to be Scottish.
Is there a last chance to see
Sure.
Jonathan in a
Skirt?
I wasn't aware that was something you could sign up for.
There's a reason why they call it a kilt. That's what happens to people who call it a skirt.
Very good.
I'd also like to mention on behalf of Bruce and myself, we hope to see most of you next Wednesday, but we still haven't heard from everybody. So don't tell us now, please send an email. That's how we keep track. Thanks.
Did you just send you an email?
I can remember.
Okay. That's next Tuesday?
Show up any day. We have an issue of the Planning Commissioners Journal for new members of boards. I think there's other things in there as well.
Take it home. Part of the library now.
Is that just for our information?
No, this can be tested.
It's also a great coloring book for the kids.
No. I already recycled mine.
There's a lot of forgotten bags there.
I shouldn't put it in recycling yet.
Anything else?
I thought the drawing was kind
Yes, Ms. Brestrup.
One new ZBA application. It's a special permit to create a supplemental apartment at 32 Moreland Street, and I think Moreland Street is that neighborhood just north of the university off North Pleasant Street. Are you interested in seeing anything about that? John and Laura Strandland. Is it Moreland Street near Valley View? Yeah.
Not sensing any interest here.
No? Okay.
Trust the ZBA.
Trust the ZBA.
Trust the ZBA.
Just the ZBA, okay.
No committee reports, no report of the chair. Any report of staff? I think we just had it.
You just had it.
We're adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
All right.